Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift with me into the dimly lit alleys of the medieval world, where flickering lanterns cast trembling shadows on cobbled streets, and the air is heavy with dread and secrets. Our story, slow as candle wax, will follow the life of a single weary soul, one of those who wore the beaked mask and dark robes that haunt old paintings and nightmares alike, a plague doctor. Over 22 parts, we shall wander beside him through fear and filth, silent prayers and whispered regrets, to discover why it truly, deeply, and bitterly sucked to be a plague doctor in those forgotten centuries. May these words cradle you gently into slumber, even as they stir your curiosity for the next tale to come. Let us begin with his first steps into a world that smelled of rot and hopelessness. His name, for now, is lost to time. In the records of the town council, he was merely called Medicus Pestis, the doctor of the pestilence. In life, he might have been a simple physician's apprentice, the son of a modest candlemaker who scraped enough coin to send his boy to learn the arts of healing. But in the year of our story, his name mattered less than the mask he wore. He had arrived at the city gates at dusk. The sun bled behind the distant hills like an old wound that would not close. Crows perched on the battlements, watching him with glistening eyes, as if they alone understood what he was about to step into. The guards at the gate did not bother to check his satchel, nor question his purpose. His robes and the long leather beak declared his grim trade. With a nod, they let him through, and the heavy iron gate groaned shut behind him like a tomb door. The city smelled of damp earth, coal smoke, and something sweeter, something foul, like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. He paused under the stone archway, taking a slow breath behind his mask. The herbs stuffed inside, lavender, sage, rosemary, could not fully mask the stench of decay that clung to the narrow lanes. He wondered, not for the first time, why he had said yes to this task. Perhaps it was pride, or desperation. A young physician's path was not easily paved with coin. Nobles hired learned men from foreign universities, old surgeons with gilded tools and Latin phrases. Who would trust an unproven youth to tend their ailments, unless those ailments were so dreadful that no one else would dare come close? A child watched him from behind a shutter. He glimpsed the pale round face, wide-eyed and trembling. She vanished before he could lift his gloved hand in greeting. He could almost hear the mother whispering, "Close the window, child. Do not breathe the same air as him." His lodgings were not in an inn. No respectable innkeeper would house the plague doctor, whose very presence was said to invite the angel of death to linger at the door. Instead, the town council had prepared for him a small, drafty room above an abandoned tavern. Its sign, a cracked carving of a black boar, swung in the breeze with a tired creak. Inside, he found only a straw pallet, a battered chest, and a table upon which rested a single, sputtering candle. He sat for a moment, listening to the wooden beams creak and the wind hiss through the loose shutters. He removed his hat and mask, setting them gently on the table. His face beneath was young, though the weeks of travel and worry had carved lines deeper than his age deserved. He caught his reflection in a cracked shard of mirror. Eyes sunken, skin pale, lips pressed tight as if to hold in his fear. He thought of home then, of his mother's warm bread, the hum of bees in the garden, the smell of tallow and fresh linen. He had left it all behind in hopes of proving himself worthy, of earning enough gold to start his own modest practice, perhaps even marry the girl who had written him soft letters sealed with blue ribbon. But here, in this rotting city, those dreams seemed as thin and brittle as the flame of his candle. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find a young boy, no more than 12, holding a sealed parchment in trembling hands. His nose was red from crying, his tunic too big for his thin frame. "Sir Doctor," the boy said, voice raw and hoarse. "My mother, she's coughing, won't wake. Please come." He wanted to shut the door, to tell the boy to run away, to go find someone else, anyone else. But there was no one else. That was the truth behind his strange power. He was the only one who would come when death knocked first. He took up his mask once more. The beak scraped the edge of the table as he fitted it back over his face. He reached for his satchel. Inside, small vials of vinegar, cloth strips soaked in wine, dried herbs for poultices. Tools of little power, but they were all he had. In that moment, as he stepped past the boy into the moonlit street, he realized how heavy the mask truly was. It weighed more than leather and iron. It carried dread and blame and the hopeless prayers of the dying. And he who wore it was already halfway to becoming a ghost himself. Through alleys and past shuttered doors they went. Rats scurried ahead, brazen in their claim of the streets. The boy pointed to a narrow house wedged between a butcher and a candlemaker's shop. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, but the windows were dark. Inside, the mother lay on a straw pallet much like his own. Her lips were cracked, eyes glassy, breath rattling in her throat like pebbles in a tin. He opened her mouth, checked her pulse, touched her forehead with gloved fingers. She stirred only faintly, a groan slipping from her cracked lips. There was little he could do. He poured vinegar on his cloth, pressed it to her brow, whispered gentle words that could not heal but might soothe. The boy knelt at his mother's side, holding her hand, tears dripping onto the thin blanket. Outside, a church bell tolled, slow, heavy strokes that counted the hours or the deaths. He could not tell which. He packed his tools, gave the boy a morsel of bread from his satchel, and rose to leave. He could do no more. And in the days ahead, he would find that was the cruelest truth of all. He could do so very little, yet he had to keep walking these streets, again and again, a lone figure in the dark, carrying hope that turned to ash in his hands. He stepped back into the night, mask glinting in the moonlight, the boy's quiet sobs following him down the alley until they faded into the hush of the sleeping, suffering city. And so began the long, bitter vigil of the plague doctor. By dawn, the streets were no less empty, but the silence had grown heavier, as though the city itself were holding its breath beneath the veil of morning mist. The plague doctor, his boots slick with dew and mud, trudged back toward his lodging beneath the swinging sign of the Black Boar. His satchel weighed on his shoulder, pressing into his bones like a reminder that he was never to rest easy, not while the plague lay coiled in every shadow. He paused before the tavern's crooked door. In the hush before the first cries of the vendors and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, he could hear the rustle of rats behind the walls, the muffled coughs drifting from shuttered rooms above the narrow street. He knew what those coughs meant. Soon they would come for him. Men with hollow eyes and trembling voices, women who clutched at his sleeves with hands already cold with fever. And he would go, again and again, to stand helpless at bedsides that smelled of sweat, rot, and old prayers. Inside his room, the candle he had left burned low, a little island of wavering gold in the gloom. He sank onto the pallet without removing his mask. His hands trembled as he unlaced his boots, fingers stiff from the chill and the fear that never quite left his bones. He remembered the boy's eyes, wide and glassy, not from sickness, but from the knowledge that by sunset, he would likely have no mother left to weep for. He told himself not to wonder about the boy's fate, yet he could not help it. He lay on the pallet, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the creaks of old beams and the soft sigh of the wind that slipped through every gap and knot in the wood. In that silence, his mind wandered backward, to the day he had first heard the word plague, spoken in the hushed, fearful tones of his old master. His master had been an elderly man with a beard the color of old parchment, who smelled of cloves and bitter tonics. It was in the master's dim study, lined with books he could not yet read, that the boy, no more than 15, had first traced the lines of plague sores in a leather-bound volume. Buboes, they called them. Dark swellings in the armpit or groin, hard as stones and hot as coals. To touch them was to touch death's seal. He remembered how his master's voice had trembled when he spoke of the pestilence that had emptied entire villages, that rode the trade routes from east to west, that crept into cities by ship and caravan, nestling first in fleas and rats, then in the warm folds of human flesh. The boy had listened with the morbid curiosity of youth, unable to imagine such horror could ever stalk him personally. Now, years later, it had. The beaked mask, once a curiosity hanging on his master's wall, an artifact of old outbreaks, had become his only armor against a foe he could neither see nor defeat. Within the beak, he had stuffed sprigs of rosemary, dried lavender, and crushed mint leaves, the scents sharp enough to make his eyes sting. They told him the herbs would purify the air, that the pestilence floated like a foul vapor, and that his mask might keep it at bay. He knew it was wishful thinking. He wore the mask not to conquer the plague, but to remind others, and himself, that he was not truly a man anymore, but a sentinel of sickness. He rose from the pallet, stripped off his gloves, and washed his hands in a chipped basin with vinegar and water gone cold. The sting of it kept him awake when sleep threatened to drag him under. When he caught his reflection in the basin's trembling surface, he saw how pale he had grown, how the dark circles beneath his eyes seemed carved into his skull. A knock at the door startled him, the second in as many hours. He opened it to find not another desperate family, but a man clad in the drab gray robes of the town council's steward. The steward carried a ledger, its cover stained with ink and the faint outline of a wax seal. He did not step inside. Instead, he handed the doctor a list, written in a hurried hand that left blotches where tears might have fallen. "These are the houses you must visit today," the steward said, his voice flat as the stones beneath their feet. "Lord Mayor says to write down how many are dead, how many alive, but marked. Burn the straw bedding if you can. Burn whatever you must." The doctor nodded, tucking the list into his satchel. He wondered if the steward noticed how his gloved hands shook. If he did, he said nothing. He only glanced once at the mask resting on the table, its long, curved beak turned toward him like an accusing finger, before he turned and clattered down the stairs without another word. Left alone again, the doctor traced a finger down the list. 17 houses. Names he did not know. Whole families reduced to ink and paper. He imagined the tiny rooms, the mothers clutching infants who would not live to learn their fathers' names, the old men whose prayers rattled in lungs, already drowned by the sickness. He replaced his gloves, donned the mask once more, and slung the satchel across his chest. At the threshold, he hesitated, one hand on the latch. Outside, the morning bells were ringing, calling the faithful to Mass. He wondered if the priests still dared to stand at the altar, if they feared the pestilence might cling to the holy water and settle into the creases of the chalice. He had once been a faithful boy himself, but now his prayers were thin and shapeless, spoken mostly to the cold dawn air as he stepped out to face another day. He pulled the door shut behind him. The Black Boar's sign creaked overhead as if to bid him farewell, though he knew it would not welcome him back with warmth or comfort. There was no comfort for him now, only the endless trudge through streets where every door was a promise of more suffering. As he made his way down the alley, his boots leaving damp prints in the morning fog, he caught sight of another figure in the distance, a woman peering from behind her shutters, clutching a rosary so tightly the beads must have cut into her palms. She crossed herself when she saw him, whispered a prayer he could not hear. He wished he could tell her that her prayers might save her, that her faith could hold the pestilence at bay. But he knew better, and so he walked on, the lonely shadow of a man who had traded his name for a mask and his peace for a hopeless duty that would follow him to his grave and perhaps beyond. He found the first house near the edge of the old quarter, where the buildings leaned into each other like drunken men sharing secrets. The door was ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges, as if someone had fled in haste and left the plague to seep out into the street. The doctor paused at the threshold, drawing a slow breath through the herbs packed into his mask. He could hear the soft buzzing of flies before he stepped inside. The room was dark, but for a single window, its shutters half open to the gray dawn. Dust motes danced in the weak light, settling on a table that still held the remains of a meal, bread turned hard as stone, a cup of ale untouched. A woman lay on a straw pallet in the corner, her body covered to the chin with a thin, filthy blanket. He moved closer, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to cling to the walls. He crouched beside her, listening for breath. What came instead was a low, wet rattle, proof that death had not yet claimed her but waited patiently just beyond the edge of the bed. He pushed the blanket back gently. Her face was swollen, skin flushed with fever, dark blotches blooming like ink stains along her neck. He touched her forehead through his gloves, feeling the heat of a fire he could not quench. A soft cry pulled his eyes downward. At her side, curled against her wasted frame, lay a child, no older than 4, pale and motionless, but for the slight rise and fall of his small chest. The boy's tiny fist clutched the mother's sleeve, as if even in fevered sleep, he knew not to let her drift too far away. The sight of it pierced deeper than the stench or the sores ever could. He unpacked his satchel, working by habit more than hope. He found a rag, soaked it in vinegar, and dabbed at the mother's brow. She stirred, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Only a faint wheeze that ended in a cough, so wet it sprayed the cloth with flecks of dark blood. He folded the rag away, dropping it into a small leather pouch that already reeked of sickness. He turned his attention to the child. The boy's skin was cold, though no blotches marked his thin neck or arms yet. He pressed a hand to the boy's cheek, whispering a prayer he half remembered from his own childhood. The words felt hollow inside the mask, muffled by the scent of lavender and old leather. He knew the council would want him to mark the house for burning. He could see it in his mind's eye. The steward with the ledger, scribbling a line beside the address. The city guards piling straw and oil against the walls at dusk. Fire was the only cure they trusted now. But looking at the boy, he found his resolve wavering. There was still breath in that tiny body, however faint, however fleeting. The mother's eyes fluttered open. Clouded and glassy, they drifted to the strange bird face looming over her. She made a sound, a word maybe, but her throat failed her. She reached out with a trembling hand, fingertips brushing the stiff leather of his sleeve. He could feel her plea even through the layers of cloth and waxed fabric. "Save him," her touch seemed to beg. "If you cannot save me, save him." His mind raced through what little he could do. He could try a poultice of garlic and wine, wrap the boy in fresh linen, keep him warm and dry and fed. All words he had repeated to dozens before, all of whom still lay in graves or burned to ash beneath the watchful eyes of crows. Still, he could not bring himself to abandon the boy just yet. He lifted the child carefully, feeling how light he was, lighter than a sack of flour. The boy stirred, a tiny whimper escaping cracked lips. He tucked him into the crook of his arm and turned back to the mother. She watched, her chest rising and falling with labored gasps. He wanted to tell her something, anything that might ease the terror behind her eyes. But what comfort could there be when the only promise he could make was that she would not be alone when death came? He whispered a soft prayer, pressing 2 fingers to her forehead in a clumsy blessing, then turned away. At the door, he paused and looked back once more. She lay still now, her eyes drifting shut again, her hand falling limp against the straw. He did not know if she would wake again. Part of him hoped she wouldn't. Outside, the air felt sharper than before, biting through his robes and gloves. He cradled the boy closer to his chest, feeling the child's weak heartbeat against his own. He knew he could not take the boy back to his own lodging. If word spread that the plague doctor kept the infected with him, even the abandoned tavern would slam its doors against him. He would be forced to sleep in the alleys, more a rat than the rats themselves. So he turned down the alley and made for the church. The bell was ringing again, slow and mournful. As he neared the heavy oak doors, he saw the parish priest standing on the steps, clutching his cross to his chest. The priest was young, far too young to wear the weight of a parish drowning in pestilence, but his eyes were steady as he watched the masked figure approach. Without a word, the doctor lifted the boy in a silent plea. The priest glanced at the child, then at the beaked mask, and a shiver passed through him. But he did not step back. Instead, he opened his arms. The doctor handed the child over, careful not to let their skins touch. The priest cradled the boy as if he were his own brother, murmuring a prayer too soft to catch. Inside the church, candles flickered beneath stained glass windows that glowed dimly in the morning light. The doctor watched for a moment, standing in the doorway like a shadow. He knew the child would likely die here too. Perhaps a little warmer, perhaps hearing hymns instead of the rats in the walls. But for now, it was the best he could give. He turned away before the priest could speak, before pity could slip between them and remind him how much of himself he had already buried beneath leather and herbs. He stepped back into the street, the city waiting for him like a wound that would never close. The list in his satchel pressed against his ribs with every step. 16 houses left. 16 doors that might open to hope or despair, but mostly despair. He walked on, a lone figure drifting through the waking city, his shadow stretching long behind him, in the pale light of a sun that did not yet know whether it should bother to rise again. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to cast its pale warmth on the tiled roofs, but its touch did nothing to lift the chill that clung to the plague doctor's bones. He moved through the winding streets like a wraith, his mask turning heads wherever he passed. Children shrank back behind doorframes. Merchants crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. Even the beggars gave him a wide berth, pressing their backs to crumbling walls, as if the pestilence clung to his shadow. The fourth house on his list stood at the end of a narrow lane, its walls stained with damp and its windows shuttered tight despite the weak warmth of the sun. A bundle of rosemary and garlic hung above the door, brown and wilted, a feeble charm meant to keep the sickness at bay. He paused before it, reading the faded chalk mark on the doorframe. A simple cross, hastily drawn, it told him all he needed to know. He rapped on the door with the butt of his cane, 3 dull knocks that seemed to echo down the empty lane. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then, slowly, the door creaked inward, revealing a gaunt man, hair unkempt, eyes red-rimmed and sunken. He held a cloth to his mouth, though whether it was to hide his cough or his fear, the doctor could not tell. "Doctor," the man rasped, voice raw as old parchment. "It's my wife. She's not well. And my boy." His words trailed off into a dry cough that racked his thin frame. Without waiting for an invitation, the doctor stepped inside. The air was thick with the sour smell of sweat and spoiled food. The single room was dim, lit only by a thin shaft of light slipping through a gap in the shutters. In the corner, a woman lay on a pallet piled with tattered blankets. Her skin was waxy, her breathing shallow and ragged. At her side, a boy no older than 10 sat cross-legged, staring at nothing, his face blank with exhaustion. The doctor knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the child. He lifted the edge of the blanket, checking for the telltale swellings at her neck and under her arms. He found them easily, angry, swollen lumps that throbbed beneath her thin skin. He could feel the heat radiating from them even through his gloves. He looked at the husband who hovered by the hearth, wringing the cloth in his hands until it threatened to tear. "How long?" the doctor asked, his voice muffled by the mask. 2 days, the man said, his words tumbling out in a rush. She started with a fever, then the lumps came. I tried to give her broth to keep her warm, but..." He gestured helplessly at the cold hearth. There was no wood left, only a few gray embers. The doctor pulled a vial of vinegar from his satchel and a clean strip of linen. He soaked the cloth and pressed it to the woman's brow. She flinched at the touch, a soft whimper escaping her cracked lips. He turned to the boy, who stared at the doctor's mask with wide, unblinking eyes. "Have you eaten?" the doctor asked the boy softly. The boy shook his head. His lips were dry, flakes of skin clinging to the corners. The doctor reached into his satchel, pulling out the last piece of hard bread he carried. He broke it in half, offering it to the boy. Tiny hands took it without a word, and the child chewed slowly, as if afraid it might vanish if he dared to swallow too quickly. The husband sank onto a stool by the door, his head in his hands. "What will happen to her?" he asked, voice cracking under the weight of the question. The doctor could not bring himself to lie. "Pray," he said simply. It was all he could offer. Pray, and hope that when the end came, it would come swiftly. He moved through the room, checking the windows, the blankets, the stale water in a cracked jug. There was nothing here that could ease her passing. He wished, not for the first time, that he were a barber surgeon with poultices and knives, and the right to bleed a patient dry in the hope that the sickness might follow the blood. But he had no license for cutting. All he had were his herbs, his vinegar, and the mask that made people believe he could do more than whisper prayers over the dying. He stepped outside into the thin sunlight, motioning for the husband to follow. They stood in the lane, the wind tugging at the man's threadbare sleeves. The doctor pulled a small coin from his purse and pressed it into the man's trembling palm. "Buy wood," he said. "Keep her warm. Boil water if you can. Burn the bedding when it is done." The husband stared at the coin as if it might vanish. His eyes glistened with tears that he did not wipe away. "Bless you, doctor," he said hoarsely. "Bless you." But the doctor turned away before the man could speak more. He did not want the blessing. He did not deserve it. He had not healed her. He had not saved her. He had done nothing but count her among the doomed and left a coin behind like a merchant closing a bargain. As he walked back down the lane, he saw the neighbors peering from behind their shutters, eyes wide with fear and hunger for any scrap of hope he might bring. But when they saw the mark on the door, they turned away quickly, crossing themselves as if to ward off the doctor's shadow. He moved on to the next house, the list in his satchel growing heavier with each name he crossed out. By the time the sun dipped westward, painting the rooftops in gold and ash, he had visited 3 more homes. Each door opened onto the same sorrow. Bodies feverish and still, rooms heavy with the stench of sickness, faces pleading for miracles that had long since fled these streets. And when night finally fell and the bells tolled vespers from the high tower, the plague doctor found himself alone once more beneath the sign of the Black Boar. He leaned against the tavern's rough wall, the mask cold and damp against his skin. In the street below, a dog barked at nothing, and far off, the first owls began to call through the twilight. He closed his eyes, listening to the hush of the city settling into uneasy sleep. In his mind, he saw the faces again. The mother clutching her child, the father begging for warmth he could not afford, the boy who had not spoken a word but had eaten the bread crumb by crumb as if it were life itself. He knew he would see their faces again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, until the ledger was full and the pestilence had eaten its fill. He pushed himself upright, the mask creaking as he tilted his head back to the darkening sky. Somewhere above, hidden by clouds and smoke, the stars waited for night. And so did he. One man in a mask, a fragile barrier between life and the darkness that crept ever closer with each passing hour. Sleep came to him fitfully that night, like a hesitant guest that hovered at the threshold but dared not step inside. The pallet beneath him prickled with old straw, the blanket thin as moth wings, yet it was not the cold that kept him awake. It was the echo of voices, hushed prayers whispered in dim rooms, the ragged coughs, the muffled weeping of children too young to understand the cruelty of their world. When at last his eyes did close, they opened again well before dawn, drawn from uneasy dreams by the distant toll of the church bell, one slow, mournful note that drifted through the darkness like a lament for the living. He sat up, bones aching as if he had aged decades in a single night. In a way, he had. Each face, each house, each whispered plea carved a new line into the map of his soul. He dressed by candlelight, the flame flickering against the walls, chasing shadows that seemed all too eager to linger. He dipped his hands in the basin of cold water, scrubbing them raw with vinegar, though he knew it would not scrub away what clung to him. He ran a finger down the list in his satchel. 11 more homes. 11 more lantern-lit doorways where death waited, silent and patient. Before stepping out, he paused to light another stub of candle and set it by the cracked window. It was foolish, but he liked to imagine its faint glow was a promise, a small beacon to guide him back through the fog, no matter how heavy the night might grow. The streets before dawn were hushed, cloaked in mist that curled around the corners like a living thing. His boots struck the cobbles with dull, steady thuds. Rats scattered before him, vanishing into drains and gutters, slick with last night's rain. He wondered if they mocked him, these tiny kings of the plague, carrying death on their fleas, while he carried it in his satchel, hidden behind futile herbs and hollow prayers. The first house of the day stood near the butcher's lane, where the smell of old blood and spoiled meat clung to the air even in the chill of early morning. A woman waited at the door, wrapped in a shawl that did nothing to hide the tremble in her shoulders. She held a lantern, its feeble light dancing on the wet stones. "Doctor?" she whispered when he approached, as though to speak too loudly might wake the sickness inside. "It's my husband. He won't wake." She led him through a narrow passageway into a cramped room where the smell hit him like a blow. Sweat, stale ale, the rank sweetness of decay starting to settle in the flesh. The man lay sprawled across a rough pallet, his chest bare, his skin slick with fever's final sheen. A candle guttered on a crate beside him, casting a trembling glow over his sunken cheeks. The doctor knelt and touched the man's wrist. Cold. No pulse beneath the thin skin. He pressed his ear to the man's chest, though he already knew what he would, or would not, hear. Silence, broken only by the rasp of the woman's breath behind him. He rose slowly, meeting her eyes through the round glass lenses of his mask. She stared at him, searching for an answer he did not have the grace to give. "Gone," he said gently. The word felt too small for the void it left behind. She sank to her knees beside the pallet, clutching the man's hand in both of hers, rocking back and forth. No tears came. Perhaps she had shed them all long before the final breath. The doctor stood by, useless, an intruder on grief that needed no witness. After a moment, he crouched again, drawing from his satchel a small scrap of linen soaked in vinegar. He cleaned the man's lips, closed his eyes with a careful touch. A poor ritual, but it was all he could offer. Outside, the butcher's lane was waking, the distant clang of a cleaver, the bleat of goats that had survived another night. When he stepped back into the dawn, the woman's sobs drifted after him, carried by the wind that stirred the mists around his feet. He marked the house on his list, then tucked it away before the ink could blur with the damp that clung to his gloves. The next house took him deeper into the maze of alleys, where broken shutters swung like pendulums and stray dogs rooted through scraps. A boy waited for him there, perched on a step, knees hugged to his chest. He sprang up when he saw the doctor, his eyes wide, a fragile spark of hope where none should have survived. "Mama said you would come," the boy breathed, voice thin as morning frost. Inside, the room was so small, he had to crouch beneath the low beams. A woman lay curled on a bed of old rags. She clutched a rag doll to her chest, its cloth face rubbed nearly blank by years of small hands. She looked up at him with eyes that barely focused, her lips moving around words that never formed. The doctor touched her wrist, weak but alive. He rummaged through his satchel for dried sage, crumbling the brittle leaves into a cup of water that had grown cloudy in its clay jug. He lifted her head, coaxing the bitter brew past cracked lips. She choked on the taste, but swallowed. He did not know if it would help. He gave it anyway. He looked at the boy who stood stiff and brave by the door, fists balled at his sides. "Stay warm," the doctor said. "Boil water if you can. Keep her covered." He left half of his bread in the boy's trembling hands. The child nodded solemnly, clutching it to his chest like a relic. The doctor stepped back into the alley, his mask catching the weak sunlight. Above him, crows wheeled in lazy circles, waiting for the city to feed them again. So the morning passed, house after house. He moved through rooms where hope flickered like a candle on its last drop of tallow, sometimes sputtering out before his eyes, sometimes lingering just long enough to trick him into believing his presence mattered. Each doorway swallowed him whole and spit him back into the streets, a little heavier, a little more hollow. By the time the church bells rang noon, he found himself standing at a crossroads where two narrow lanes met. He paused there, the mask heavy on his face, the satchel digging into his shoulder. He could feel the sweat pooling at the nape of his neck, trapped by the leather hood. He wanted to sit. He wanted to sleep. He wanted, impossibly, to forget. But the list in his pocket tugged him forward. 8 more homes, 8 more doors, and somewhere behind each, another prayer, another pair of eyes that would search his mask for a miracle he did not carry. So he walked on, the plague doctor, alone, but for the wind that whispered through the alleys and the soft beat of crows' wings overhead, counting down the city's breaths one shadow at a time. By mid-afternoon, the doctor's steps had grown slower, as if each footfall pressed him deeper into the mire of the city's suffering. The day had warmed enough to make the damp air cling to his robes, heavy with the stench of smoke and sickness. His mask, once an oddity, now a prison, grew stifling beneath the sun's pale touch. He longed to lift it, to feel the breeze on his skin, but he dared not. The herbs within the beak were his only barrier, thin as parchment, between breath and contagion. He crossed a small square where a fountain, once the pride of the neighborhood, stood dry and cracked. A lone child, perched at its base, knees drawn to her chest, humming to herself as she traced circles in the dust with a broken twig. She watched him pass without fear, too young perhaps to understand the meaning of the beaked mask. Or perhaps she understood too well and had already learned that fear was a luxury in these streets. His next stop was a cluster of cramped cottages pressed together like the pages of an old ledger, each door marked with chalk in one way or another. Crosses, circles, desperate pleas for mercy scribbled in childish scrawl. He found the house by the sharp smell that drifted before he even reached the door, a mix of vinegar, stale sweat, and the unmistakable sweetness that came when life began to slip away. Inside, the single room was dark. Heavy blankets had been nailed across the windows to keep out the draft, or the eyes of neighbors who no longer wished to see what lay beyond their walls. A thin figure huddled by the hearth, tending a pot that barely steamed. She looked up when he entered, her face hollow, her eyes so wide they seemed to drink up all the dim light. "My sister," she whispered before he could ask. Her voice cracked around the word. "She won't stop coughing. She says she sees our mother. She says our mother calls to her." He nodded once, gliding past her toward the pallet set beneath the hearth's flickering glow. The girl on the bed looked no older than 17. Her hair, once thick and dark, was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her lips were pale and cracked. As he knelt beside her, her eyes fluttered open, startled, as though she had expected someone else to come. He pressed a hand to her neck, feeling the pulse flicker like a moth's wing. When she coughed, he could hear the wet rattle deep in her chest, the sound of lungs drowning from within. There was nothing he could give her to halt it, no potion or poultice that could coax the pestilence from her blood. He tried anyway, if only to ease the fear in her sister's eyes. He drew a vial of rosewater from his satchel, precious, meant to mask the scent of the dying more than to heal them. He dipped a rag into it and brushed it gently along the girl's brow, murmuring soft words that he did not remember meaning. When she coughed again, he lifted her upright, holding her thin shoulders in his gloved hands until the fit passed. Her head lolled against his arm, eyes drifting past him to the dark corners of the room. A faint smile tugged at her cracked lips. "Mother?" she rasped, the word barely a breath. "Is it time?" The doctor glanced at the older sister, who stood frozen by the hearth, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle her sobs. He wished he could lie, tell the dying girl that her mother waited in some warm, bright place. But lies felt heavier than truth inside the mask, and there were no lies strong enough to undo the pestilence's grip. He laid her gently back on the pallet, folding the thin blanket over her chest. The sister moved to his side, clutching his sleeve. "Please," she whispered, "tell me what to do." He pulled his mask back slightly, not enough to break the seal of herbs, but enough so his voice carried clearer through the beak. "Keep her warm," he said. "Speak softly to her. Let her hear your voice until she sleeps." The girl sank beside the pallet, her tears slipping free at last as she gathered her sister's limp hand into her own. The doctor rose to his feet, his knees stiff and aching. He wanted to offer more, food, coin, a promise that they would see tomorrow together. But his purse was empty now, and his words were worth even less than that. He stepped out into the lane, the door creaking closed behind him. The sky above was dimming already, clouds gathering in the west where the sun should have lingered. A cold breeze curled around the corner, tugging at the hem of his robe. He shivered despite the layers, though whether from the wind or the thought of the dying girl calling to a mother who could not answer, he did not know. He leaned for a moment against the rough wall of the nearest house, pressing the beak of his mask to the stone as if it might cool the fever in his thoughts. He listened to the muted sounds of the neighborhood, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of shutters, the coughs that drifted through cracks in the walls like restless spirits. He still had 4 houses to visit before dusk. His fingers brushed the list again, tracing the next name written in a careful, curling hand. He wondered who had written it. Perhaps the same steward who had come to his door with the ledger and the cold command to count the living and the dead. Perhaps a clerk tucked safely away in the town hall, far from the streets where the air itself tasted of sorrow. Pushing himself upright, he adjusted his satchel and started down the lane once more. His boots struck the stones in slow, measured steps, echoing off the walls like a drumbeat for the dying. He did not pause to watch the lanterns being lit one by one behind shuttered windows. He did not look up at the gathering crows perched on the rooftops. He only walked on, the plague doctor, a shadow beneath a darkening sky, carrying with him a mask of herbs and leather, and the names of those who waited in quiet rooms for a comfort he could never truly bring. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged roofs, leaving the city wrapped in a bruised twilight, The doctor's feet had grown numb inside his worn boots. His shoulders ached from the constant weight of the satchel pulling at him, but it was the mask that felt heaviest of all, a cage pressed tight to his skin, a reminder that he was no longer fully man, but something between the living and the dead. The seventh house on his list lay near the river's edge, where the fog rose thicker than anywhere else in the city. Here, the air carried the sharp tang of brine and decay, mingling with the ever-present staleness of illness. He could hear the river before he saw it, its sluggish flow muffled by mist and the distant creak of barges tied up at the wharf. He paused at the gate, a rickety thing patched together with scraps of driftwood and rope. Beyond it, a small yard lay choked with weeds and broken crates, and a single candle flickered in a window, throwing out a fragile glow that fought the creeping dark. He pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning like a wounded thing, and made his way to the door. He knocked once, 3 soft taps with his cane, then waited. A moment later, the door creaked inward to reveal an old man hunched in the doorway, wrapped in a cloak far too large for his frail frame. The man's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with suspicion, peered out at the dark figure before him. "Plague doctor," the old man rasped, his voice like dry reeds in the wind. "You've come too late for me, I think." The doctor inclined his head, the beak dipping in the candlelight. "You called for me," he said, voice muffled behind the mask's herbs. "Aye," the old man croaked, stepping aside. "Not for myself, for her." Inside, the single-room cottage was sparse. A table, 2 stools, a hearth gone cold, and a pallet by the wall where a woman lay under a threadbare blanket. She was young, too young to have come to such a place at the river's edge. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, spread around her head like a halo tarnished by sweat. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, each breath a battle against something far stronger than she. The doctor knelt beside her, lifting her wrist with practiced care. The pulse was there, but faint and fluttering. He could see the dark swellings along her neck, the angry blotches spreading like spilled ink beneath her skin. He turned to the old man, who had shuffled to the hearth and now stared into its dead embers. "Who is she to you?" the doctor asked. "My daughter," the old man said, and the words cracked in the middle. He did not look up, but his shoulders trembled beneath the cloak. "She came here when the city turned its back on her, said the river would carry her troubles away." He let out a sound that might have been a laugh once, but now was just a breath rattling in an empty chest. The river brought her nothing but more sorrow. The doctor searched his satchel for anything: rosemary, clove oil, even the scraps of clean linen that remained. He worked in silence, pressing a damp cloth to the woman's brow, dabbing away the sweat that pooled at her temples. He whispered soft prayers, half-remembered lines from his mother's lips long ago, words that meant little but somehow filled the quiet. The old man drifted closer, lowering himself onto a stool that creaked under his brittle weight. He watched the doctor's every move with hollow eyes, as if hoping that the mask might truly hold secrets, hidden cures locked behind the leather beak. "Tell me," the old man rasped after a time, "tell me she will see another dawn." The doctor did not lift his gaze from the woman's fevered face. He smoothed her hair back, brushing it from her damp brow. "I cannot promise that," he said softly. The old man let out a sigh that sagged his whole frame. He bent forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the cracks in the floorboards as though they might swallow him whole. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the distant calls of river birds settling for the night. The woman stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. For a heartbeat, the doctor thought she looked at him, at the strange bird face that hovered above her, but her gaze drifted past him, unfocused, to a place he could not see. "Father?" she breathed, the word little more than a sigh. The old man was at her side in an instant, his gnarled hands wrapping around hers. "I'm here, my dove," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm here." The doctor leaned back, giving them space, though there was nowhere else to go in the cramped room. He could feel the warmth of their grief pressing against the cool emptiness within his own chest. He wondered if the old man had feared this moment more than death itself, watching a child slip away while the river outside kept flowing, uncaring, eternal. The candle guttered on the table, its flame wavering as if it too were fighting for breath. The doctor checked the woman's pulse again. slower now, softer, fading with every shallow gasp. He closed his eyes for a moment behind the mask, wishing the herbs inside might drown out the bitter truth that lingered on the stale air. When the final breath came, it did so quietly, a sigh that seemed to drift through the cottage and out the broken shutters, carried on the river's whisper. The old man stayed hunched over her, his forehead pressed to her cold hand, rocking gently as if he could cradle her back to warmth. The doctor stood, packing away his vials and cloths, though they had done nothing but witness the end. He lingered by the hearth, waiting for the old man to speak, but the cottage was silent, but for the slow creak of the stool and the wind pressing at the walls. At last, the doctor crossed the room, laying a single silver coin on the table, a poor payment for a daughter's final hour, but all he had left to give. He stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft click that sounded far louder in the hush of the river's mist. Fog wrapped around him as he returned to the lane, his breath ghosting from the beak of his mask like a sigh returned to the night. He could hear the water lapping at the muddy banks, the groan of a barge shifting in its moorings, the faint echo of the old man's grief lost in the fog. Another house crossed off the list. Another soul counted by a man who could not stop the counting. He turned away from the river, boots sinking into the damp earth, and pressed onward through the mist that seemed to swallow even his shadow. There were more names yet, more rooms waiting in silence, where prayers would hang unanswered in the stale air, and a lone doctor would kneel again and again beneath a mask that grew heavier with every breath. He did not return to his room above the Black Boar that night. The fog by the river had seeped into his bones, made his limbs feel leaden and untrustworthy, so he found himself drifting instead toward the old market square, where the stones still held the warmth of the day long after the sun had vanished behind the hills. There, beneath the empty stalls where once fishmongers and cloth sellers had called out their prices to the hum of crowds, he found a corner sheltered from the wind. He sank down upon a broken crate, his back pressed to the rough wall of an abandoned shop. Above him, a faded sign swung lazily, a painted goose, its colors cracked and peeling. Once, perhaps, the shop had sold geese or feathers for the quills that filled the ledgers now marking the city's dying. Now it offered nothing but a little cover for a man who did not dare call himself weary. He removed his gloves first. The fingers beneath were pale and wrinkled, the nails rimmed with grime that no vinegar could wash away. He flexed them slowly, feeling the ache that had settled deep into his knuckles. Then, with care, he unfastened the mask, easing the leather straps from behind his ears, lifting the beak away from his face for the first time since dusk. The night air touched his damp skin like a confession, cool and honest, free of rosemary and cloves. He closed his eyes and let himself breathe it in, unfiltered, reckless as that might be. He wanted, for a moment, to believe the pestilence did not swirl unseen in the mist, did not cling to every stone and rafter and window latch, but he could almost feel it, brushing his cheeks, settling on his lashes. He pressed a sleeve to his mouth, more out of habit than hope. Above him, a lantern flickered in an upper window, its soft glow spilling onto the cobbles. He wondered who sat awake behind that shutter, what mother or father lingered there, listening for the first cough that would shatter the thin glass of their safety. He wondered if they knew he sat below them now, not a deliverer of miracles, but a witness to their doom. A rat scurried past his boot, bold enough to pause and look up at him with glistening eyes before darting under the broken stall. He envied its simplicity, its hunger, its blind, dumb purpose. The rat did not carry sorrow in its belly, did not catalog the names of the lost. It merely survived. He leaned back against the wall, tilting his head to rest against the cold stone. Sleep did not come easily, but exhaustion pressed its claim until at last his eyes drifted shut. For a while, he dreamed he was far from here, back in the garden behind his father's candle shop, the air rich with the smell of beeswax and roses. He saw his mother's hands, flour-dusted and warm, brushing crumbs from a wooden table. He heard her humming, low and steady, a lullaby meant to hush both children and the darkness that sometimes gathered in the corners of old houses. He dreamed, too, of the girl by the river, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes seeking her father's face as if it might tether her to the world for just one heartbeat more. And he dreamed of the old man's hands, cradling a memory that the river would carry away in the end. He woke with a start when the church bell rang out somewhere far behind the fog, 1, 2, 3 strokes echoing through the hollow streets. Midnight. A new day had come, though it carried nothing new within it. Only the same stench, the same heavy ledger folded tight in his satchel. He slipped the mask back on, tying the straps with fingers that fumbled in the chill. The smell of lavender and myrrh filled his lungs again, shutting out the clean taste of night. He flexed his shoulders, gathered his satchel, and rose from his makeshift rest. The market square was empty, but for the soft creak of the sign above him and the rustle of rats in the darkness. In a doorway across the square, he glimpsed a figure, thin, wrapped in rags, hunched low against the stone. A beggar, or perhaps just a man who had no home left untainted by plague. The doctor did not move toward him, nor did the figure stir. They regarded each other for a moment through the haze, two ghosts drifting in the same dream. He turned his steps away from the square and back toward the narrow streets, guided by the memory of the list that burned in his satchel like a brand. He knew the next house, had marked its door in his mind before night fell. It lay near the tanner's yard, where the air forever reeked of old hides and the bite of lie. The stench there was sharp enough to cut through the scent of death, though it did not drive it away. When he reached the lane, he found the house easily. A single lamp burned in the window, casting a trembling halo on the muddy street. He knocked softly. Once more the sound of his cane on wood echoing too loud in the hush of sleeping neighbors. This time it was a boy who answered, not more than 16, with a scrap of cloth tied around his nose and mouth, his eyes bloodshot with sleeplessness. He stepped aside without a word, leading the doctor into a cramped hallway where the air stung his nose with the sharp bite of the tannery. In a back room, a man lay on a cot built of planks and old furs. His chest rose and fell in slow, painful rhythm, and the doctor could see the dark stains that bloomed on his neck even before he drew closer. A young woman, his wife perhaps, knelt at his side, clutching a damp cloth that had long since lost its coolness. She looked up at the doctor with the same hollow stare he had come to know too well, equal parts dread and desperate hope. He lowered himself beside the cot, set down his satchel, and opened it with hands that moved through motions older than words. He worked quietly, his voice low and gentle as he asked her simple questions. When did it start? Had he eaten? Did he speak? The answers were always the same. Yesterday, no food, only fevered murmurs about debts unpaid and a promise to fix the roof once spring came. Promises that would now rot alongside so many others in the shallow graves beyond the city walls. He cleaned the man's brow, pressed herbs to the swellings, muttered a soft prayer more to the shadows than to the fevered ears before him. He did it all knowing the truth. It would not matter. But still, he did it. And when he stepped out into the lane again, the lanterns behind him flickering low, he carried with him one more whispered plea, folded into the leather mask that grew heavier with each passing name. The dawn was still hours away, but already he could feel its cold promise waiting beyond the fog, ready to drag him onward through the waking nightmare that was another day as a plague doctor in a city that never truly slept. The tanner's lane gave way to narrower alleys as he pressed deeper into the maze of the city's oldest quarter, where the buildings leaned together so closely that moonlight rarely touched the stones between them. Here, the air was rank with old secrets, mildew, rot, the ghost of hearth fires long since gone cold. Rats rustled in the shadows, their claws scratching at loose shutters and barrels left to bloat in the damp. The doctor paused beneath a crumbling archway to check his list once more. The ink had smudged where a droplet of vinegar had soaked through the fold. He traced the name with a gloved finger. The Widow Branca, Tanner's Lane Extension. A small note beside it, scribbled by the steward's hurried hand, 3 children inside. He read it twice, as if the words might shift under his gaze, transform into something less heavy. But they did not. He tucked the parchment back into his satchel, adjusted the beak of his mask, and moved on. The widow's house sat wedged between a cooper's shed and an abandoned granary. Its roof sagged inward, weeping rainwater down the brick walls in thin, dark streaks. A bundle of dried nettles and mint hung above the door, half eaten by insects, a ward against sickness that had failed long before he arrived. He knocked softly, once, twice. He could hear shuffling on the other side, a chair scraping the floor, a child's muffled cough. Then the door cracked open, and the widow's eyes met his through the gloom. She was younger than he expected, her hair hidden beneath a ragged kerchief, her skin pale but unmarked, for now. In her arms, a boy clung to her neck, thin arms locked around her shoulders. "Doctor," she breathed, her voice hushed, as if to speak too loudly might wake death from its shallow doze. She stepped aside, and he entered. Inside, the room was so small he could cross it in 3 strides. A rush mat covered most of the dirt floor, damp in the corners where rain had crept in. A hearth smoldered with the last of their wood, just enough to keep the chill at bay. In the far corner, 2 small forms huddled beneath a blanket, a girl no older than 8 and a boy of perhaps 5, their faces turned to the wall, as if sleep might hide them from what loomed behind the mask. "It's the youngest," the widow said, shifting the boy in her arms so he could see the doctor's masked face. "Little Rado. His fever won't break. He can't keep down broth. The other 2?" Her voice caught, a quiet break that trembled in her throat. The other 2 still breathed well enough. The doctor set down his satchel and knelt by the hearth, motioning for her to bring the boy closer to the glow. She lowered herself carefully, cradling the child in her lap, while the other 2 watched with wide, fearful eyes. He felt their gaze, but kept his own on the child. So small, his cheeks flushed crimson against the shadows of the room. He touched the boy's forehead. Heat radiated through his glove. He lifted one tiny eyelid, watching the sluggish roll of the eye beneath. The child stirred, murmuring something soft that made no sense. Half a dream, half a delirious prayer. The doctor asked the widow for water. She fetched it in a chipped mug, her hands trembling as she passed it to him. He mixed what little crushed sage he had left into the tepid liquid, swirling it until the leaves stained the water dark. He coaxed a few drops past the child's lips, but most dribbled down his chin. The widow wiped it away with the corner of her sleeve, her eyes never leaving the boy's face. "Please," she whispered, "please tell me he'll stay." He did not answer her. He had learned the danger of false promises long ago, words offered in kindness but repaid in bitter grief when the dawn came and the fever did not break. Instead, he focused on the simple tasks, folding the blanket tighter around the boy's thin shoulders, tucking a cloth beneath his neck to catch the sweat, murmuring to the mother that she must boil more water, burn what bedding she could if the sickness took him. The other 2 children shuffled closer when they saw him tend their brother, their wide eyes reflecting the glow of the embers. He caught a glimpse of the girl's bare feet, toes curled against the rush mat to keep warm. They were waiting, though they did not yet know for what. The doctor reached into his satchel and found a scrap of stale bread. Hard, but still bread. He broke it in half and offered it to the girl. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his glove for the briefest heartbeat. The boy beside her sniffled, pressing closer to his sister's side. When he rose, his knees cracked under the weight of standing. He looked at the widow, who clutched her son like an anchor in a rising tide. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead again, perhaps, but found no words. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the leather of his glove creaking in the silence. "Keep him warm," he said. "Boil water. Do not leave his side." She nodded. Her eyes glistened with the sheen of someone who still hoped that hope itself might be enough. He stepped outside into the lane again, the door closing softly behind him. The fog had thickened, coiling low over the stones and swallowing the shapes of the city until the houses looked like ghosts pressed close together for warmth. He stood there a moment, listening to the hush of the street. No horses, no footsteps, only the faint drip of water from a broken gutter. From his pocket he drew out the list. One more house for tonight, just one. His eyes lingered on the next name, an address near the old watchtower, where the city wall still stood stubborn against the darkness beyond. He felt its weight settle into his chest like a stone. He turned his steps toward it, the mask once more guiding him forward through streets that whispered secrets behind every shuttered window. With each footstep, the warmth of the widow's cottage fell away, replaced by the chill of knowing that not all who sleep beneath their mother's hand will wake to see the sun rise again. So he walked on, the plague doctor, alone in the fog, alone in his mask, alone with the heavy truth that no prayer or herb could fully keep the darkness at bay. In the hush of dawn, when the last whisper of night clung to the crooked eaves and the stones beneath the city walls still breathed the chill of darkness, Master Roderick pulled his mask over his face. The beaked visage, stitched from stiffened leather, smelled of last night's damp and the faint traces of vinegar he had used to clean it. It was a small comfort, that sour tang, for it promised at least a thin barrier against the humors drifting in the air. Death made invisible, carried on the sighs of the living. He rose slowly from the straw pallet that served as his bed, brushing crumbs of old bread from his cloak. The room in which he lodged was narrow, wedged between an apothecary's rear storeroom and the leaning timber wall of an abandoned bakery. Here, away from the main thoroughfares, he could sleep undisturbed, yet each night brought its own disturbance. Moans from neighboring dwellings, the scratch of rats in the rafters, the distant toll of bells that never ceased their mournful pealing. Each toll reminded him that somewhere, behind shuttered windows, another soul had drifted beyond his reach. Today, he knew, would be no different. He had woken to find a message slipped beneath his door, folded parchment marked with the sign of a black cross, sealed with wax, barely cooled when it arrived. A new household in need, a new tangle of whispered prayers and last confessions, a new test of his endurance. Pulling on his gloves, Roderick paused to glance at the small mirror nailed to the post above his wash basin. The face beneath the mask was gaunt now, though it had not been so when first he took up this calling. The plague took its tithe from those who fought it, as surely as it did from those who did nothing at all. Outside, the narrow lane lay swaddled in a thin mist. The sun was rising, yet it gave no warmth to the earth, only a wan light that painted the crooked houses in shades of gray. He moved carefully, boots splashing in puddles left by last night's rain. The air tasted of soot and tallow, mingled with the sickly sweet scent of rotting fruit that spilled from overturned barrels near the tavern. Overhead, a sign creaked in the breeze, a faded depiction of Saint Sebastian, riddled with arrows, yet serene in his suffering. As he walked, people stepped aside. Some watched him with eyes wide as coins, pressing hands to their mouths, warding off invisible spirits with quick gestures of the cross. Others turned their backs, pretending to fuss with their carts or shutters, unwilling to let his presence ruin their fragile hope that the pestilence might yet spare them. At the edge of the square, a boy no older than 10 darted from an alleyway, clutching a bundle of rags. He stared at Roderick's mask, fascinated and afraid all at once. The boy's hair was the color of wheat left too long in the sun, and his eyes were dark hollows above hollow cheeks. He held out a thin hand, palm upturned, a silent plea. Roderick stopped, reaching into the pouch at his belt. He found a stale roll and handed it over without a word. The boy snatched it, vanished back into the shadows like a mouse fleeing a cat. Roderick watched him go, wondering if the child would still be there tomorrow, or if some uncle or sister would come to fetch him away to a pit in the ground. He continued on. The house he sought was not far, a merchant's dwelling on the edge of the market square. Its door bore the same black cross that marked so many thresholds now, brushed in thick strokes of pitch. A wreath of wilted rosemary hung above it, tied with a strip of linen. Useless, perhaps, but people clung to old customs, old talismans, when faced with the unknown. He knocked, and after a long moment, the door creaked open. A servant girl peered out, her face pale, eyes rimmed red from weeping. She stepped aside, letting him pass without a word, as if to speak might loosen the sickness hiding behind her ribs. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lavender and burnt juniper. Bowls of herbs stood on every surface, lavage roux, a scattering of wormwood. They did little to mask the deeper smell beneath, the stench of sweat-soaked bedding, the sourness of breath slipping from cracked lips. In the far corner of the main chamber, a man lay in a bed, draped with rough linens. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, a sound like wind scraping through broken shutters. Roderick approached, glancing at the family clustered nearby, a woman clinging to a boy's shoulder, both of them hollow-eyed and trembling. He greeted them softly, voice muffled within the depths of his mask, his words drifting out like a prayer. "May I come closer?" They nodded as if any protest might anger whatever spirit clung to the room. Roderick leaned over the dying man, peering through the eye slits of his mask. He could see the buboes beneath the collarbone, purple-black swellings that seemed to pulse with each labored breath. He took the man's wrist, feeling the flutter of life that clung there still, fragile, thin as a moth's wing. With careful hands, he mixed a draught of vinegar and rosewater, coaxing it between cracked lips. He whispered reassurances he barely believed himself, words meant to calm the family more than the patient. No cure lay in these concoctions, only the promise of easing a final passage. Behind him, the boy began to sob, softly at first, then louder, until the mother hushed him with a trembling hand pressed to his mouth. Roderick did not turn. He had learned that to watch the living grieve while the dying lingered was a cruelty to them both. Hours passed in that dim room, broken only by the murmur of prayers and the patient's rasping sighs. Outside the shuttered window, life continued. Carts rattled over cobblestones. A vendor hawked spoiled cabbages. A distant bell rang once, twice, thrice. When at last the final breath slipped free, it did so with a softness that seemed almost kind. Roderick lowered the man's hand to his chest, closed eyes that would see no more. He stood then, a creak of leather and rustle of cloak, and turned to the family. There were no words that would suffice, so he offered only a silent nod, a promise to see the body tended properly. Outside, beyond the threshold, a fresh pit waited in the earth. It would wait for him too, someday. If not today, then tomorrow or the day after. As he stepped back into the square, the sun had risen high enough to chase the mist away, yet the shadows lingered, clinging to the edges of his mind as they did to the cobbles beneath his feet. The plague doctor's life was one of masks within masks. Some mourned for protection, others for the illusion of hope. He walked on, the beaked mask turning heads wherever he passed. Behind him, the house door closed with a soft thud, sealing sorrow inside. Ahead, the city lay waiting. More doors marked in pitch, more whispered pleas, more futile vigil. And so he went, step after step, a black bird gliding through a city that could not stop dying. It was near dusk when Roderick reached the edge of the city wall, where the stones gave way to low fields and scattered hovels that clung to the outskirts like barnacles on the hull of a ship. Here the air smelled different. Damp earth, wood smoke, the faint sweetness of wild heather caught on the breeze. It was a mercy, this scent of the countryside, for it masked the sharper reek that clung to him after each visit, the bitter traces of vinegar, sweat, and the quiet rot of fading lives. He paused by an old gate, its iron hinges rusted, the wooden door cracked and leaning. Beyond lay a small cluster of cottages, each roof sagging under the burden of thatched straw, turned gray by seasons of rain. He knew this place well enough. He had come here before, when the pestilence first crept from the city's core and began to chew at its fringes. Back then, there had been hope that distance might spare these people. The plague had proven otherwise, moving with the wind, with the merchants' carts, with the soft touch of a mother's hand upon a child's brow. A woman waited for him by the gate. She was tall, wrapped in a dark shawl, and in her arms she held a bundle that shifted as she moved. As Roderick drew closer, she lifted her chin, and he saw in the dying light that her face was lined not so much with age as with nights spent awake, listening for the ragged coughs that heralded ruin. "You are the doctor?" she asked, though the mask left no doubt. Her voice trembled, yet she stood straight, as if the fear in her belly might be caged by sheer will. He inclined his head. "Show me," he murmured through the beak. She turned, beckoning him to follow. Together they passed through the gate and down a narrow path where nettles brushed their legs. The last rays of sun tangled in the branches overhead, throwing shifting shadows that seemed to reach for them as they walked. Inside the cottage, the smell struck him first, a closeness of stale air mixed with the copper tang of blood. The hearth burned low, casting flickering light across rough walls hung with drying herbs and ragged cloth. On a pallet near the fire, a boy lay curled beneath a wool blanket too thin for the season. His eyes, half open, tracked Roderick's approach with the sluggish curiosity of fever. The woman lowered her bundle, a smaller child, limp as a broken doll, eyes shut but lips parted in a shallow wheeze. She laid the infant beside the boy, then stepped back, her hands pressed together as if in prayer, but too weary for words. Roderick knelt by the children, his gloved hands moving gently, pulling back the blankets to study the swellings beneath their necks, the rash blooming on pale skin like bruised petals. The older boy's breaths were shallow, his skin burning under Roderick's touch. The infant stirred once, a soft sigh escaping cracked lips. "How long?" Roderick asked without looking up. The woman's reply came in a whisper. 3 days, maybe 4. First the boy, then the babe. I have no one else to send." He could hear in her voice the unspoken plea, "Tell me they will live." But he did not lie, not anymore. Lies were wasted breath when the pestilence had already marked its claim. "I will do what I can," he said instead, though he knew how hollow it sounded. He opened his satchel, withdrew the small glass vial of rose oil, the linen strips, the mortar and pestle wrapped in oiled cloth. He worked quietly, grinding dried sage into a powder, mixing it with vinegar, whispering instructions the mother could follow once he was gone. Warm broth when they could swallow, cool cloths for their brows, prayers if she had them left. As he tended the children, he thought of his own mother, long buried in a village far from here. He wondered if some stranger had stood beside her pallet in her final hours, murmuring soft comforts, while knowing comfort could do nothing to halt the dark tide. Perhaps that was all this life was, a long chain of borrowed moments, each one slipping through the fingers no matter how tightly he tried to hold it. The mother hovered nearby, a shadow at the edge of his vision. Once, she asked if he would stay the night. He could not. There were more doors to knock upon, more sickness to bear witness to. And though he never admitted it, there was fear too, buried beneath his mask and layers of ritual. Fear that if he lingered too long beside the sick, the shadows he carried away would not remain outside his skin. When at last he rose, the children were still alive, though no stronger for his effort. He pressed a hand to the mother's shoulder, a gesture meant to root her in the small hope she still clutched. She looked at him, her eyes wide and hollow, yet there was something else there, too, a question he had no answer for. Why do you come if you cannot save them? Why do you wear that mask, that strange beak, if no cure lies within? He stepped outside into the darkening dusk, drawing in a breath of cool night air that tasted of rain on distant fields. Behind him, the woman closed the door, the soft thud sealing warmth and sorrow within. He knew he would not see them again. Whether they lingered a day or 2 more mattered little to the ledger he kept in his mind. Beyond the cottage, the path wound back toward the city's lights, flickering like a necklace of fireflies along the distant wall. Roderick paused there, on the threshold between village and city, and for a moment he closed his eyes within the mask's prison. He listened to the wind rustling through the grass, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. He wondered, not for the first time, how long he could stand between life and death before the mask became his only face, the beak his only voice. And when he opened his eyes again, he walked on, the night pressing close, the road ahead dark but familiar beneath his weary feet. The night deepened around Roderick as he made his way back toward the city gates. The path was little more than a rut carved by cartwheels and the slow tread of boots like his, worn smooth by years of passing feet, yet slick with damp now, the scent of rain promising another long, wet vigil before dawn. Overhead, clouds gathered low, smothering the moon in a haze of pewter light that barely touched the ground. He walked in silence, save for the soft rustle of his cloak and the occasional rasp of leather as he adjusted the mask's beak. Though the darkness pressed in close, he welcomed it. In daylight, the mask made him a figure of dread, a walking omen that death had found your street. But in the folds of night, he could almost believe himself unseen, just another shadow moving through a world too weary to care. By the time he reached the city wall, the watchman at the gate was half asleep in his booth, his breath misting the small pane of glass as he leaned forward to peer at the plague doctor's approach. They had seen each other often enough now that no words were needed. A nod, a slide of the latch, the groan of wood on iron hinges as the gate eased open just wide enough to admit him. Inside the walls, the city seemed to hold its breath. The market square lay empty, but for a few stray dogs nosing at piles of refuse, searching for scraps among rotting vegetables and tattered cloth. Roderick passed them without pause, his mind drifting back to the cottage at the edge of the fields, to the hollow eyes of the mother who had asked nothing but dared to hope for everything. He knew he should return to his lodging, rest his bones, cleanse his mask, sip the thin broth he kept warming over his small brazier. But rest had become as foreign to him as comfort, and tonight the silence felt too heavy to bear alone within four walls. So he turned instead toward the poorer quarter, where the alleys curled like veins through the city's oldest heart. Here, the houses leaned close together, timber frames groaning against one another in the wind, their windows shuttered tight against both the night and what drifted in it. He stopped at a corner where an old church squatted in the shadows. Its spire reached into the clouded sky like a pleading finger, but no bells rang from it now. Its priest had fallen ill weeks ago, and though the doors remained unlocked, few dared linger long enough to kneel inside. Still, a single candle flickered on the stone steps, set there by some trembling soul who needed to believe light might keep the pestilence at bay. Roderick stood a while beside that candle. He watched its flame dance in the wind, gutter and sway, but never quite die. Around him, the air pulsed with distant noises, a muffled cough behind a shutter, the faint roll of wheels on cobblestones as a cart passed unseen. He wondered who rode that cart tonight and whether they rode it living or dead. When at last he moved on, it was toward a small house he had not visited in many weeks. It sat nestled at the end of an alley so narrow he could touch both walls with outstretched arms. Its door, once painted green, now hung crooked on rusted hinges. But there was no black cross here, no sign of contagion. This house hid its secrets behind a quiet defiance, as if by refusing to mark itself, it might go unnoticed by death's creeping hand. Inside lived an old herbalist named Anselma. Once, long ago, she had taught Roderick the simple art of mixing sage and mint into a poultice, how to draw out infection with compresses of salt and vinegar. She had been a midwife in her younger days, a brewer of cordials and keeper of whispered charms passed down through generations who trusted the old ways more than the new. Now, she was one of the few voices in the city who would speak to him without flinching at his mask. He knocked softly. After a moment, he heard the shuffling tread of slippers, the scrape of a bolt. The door opened just enough for him to see her thin face, lined deep as riverbeds, her hair bound in a faded kerchief. "Come then," she murmured, stepping aside. "I've warm tea left on the hearth." Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of dried flowers, lavender, yarrow, and the sharp tang of thyme. Bundles hung from every beam, brushing his shoulders as he ducked to enter. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its glow softening the rough walls and the clutter of jars and pewter pots stacked on low shelves. Anselma poured him tea without asking, her gnarled hands steady despite the tremor that sometimes caught her when she reached too far or rose too quickly. He removed his gloves, but not his mask. It was habit now, almost superstition. She never asked him to take it off, perhaps understanding that some barriers were as much armor as they were prison. They sat in silence for a time, steam rising between them. The tea was bitter with rosemary and a twist of lemon balm, but it cleared the taste of vinegar that clung to his throat. On the table lay a scattering of herbs, a half-finished bundle of nettle to be steeped for fever. Roderick watched her fingers as she worked, deft even in age, and felt the ache of exhaustion slip just a fraction from his shoulders. "Bad tonight?" she asked at last, voice so soft it seemed a part of the fire's whisper. He nodded. "2 children," he said, the words muffled inside the beak. "A mother who asked for a promise I could not give." Anselma's eyes, clouded with years yet sharp with knowing, met his through the candlelight. "You give what you can, boy. The promise is not yours to keep or break." He wanted to believe her. He wanted it more than he had wanted food or sleep or the comfort of another's hand in years. But he said nothing. He only sat there while she tied up the nettle and sage, humming some tune half forgotten by the world outside these walls. When the tea was gone, he rose. She pressed the bundle into his hands. Simple herbs, nothing more, yet worth more than any gold in a city where hope was rare and fleeting. At the door, he paused. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the promise of rain. He looked back once at Anselma, who stood framed by the hearth's glow, her shadow cast long across the cluttered floor. Go on now, she said gently. There's always more waiting. He stepped into the night again, the mask firm against his face, the herbs clutched to his chest like a talisman. The rain began as he reached the end of the alley, soft at first, then steady, washing the streets clean of dust, yet never quite washing away the dread that clung to the bones of the city. He walked on beneath it, a lone figure wrapped in darkness and the hush of falling water, wondering if perhaps the rain could wash him clean too. Though he knew, as every plague doctor did, that some stains could not be washed away at all. The rain carried on through the deep hours of the night, drumming a soft, persistent rhythm upon rooftops and empty carts, upon the tarred hoods of beggars curled in doorways, upon the plague doctor's mask as Roderick moved through the winding lanes like a restless ghost. Each droplet seemed to echo within the beak, a quiet percussion that filled the hollow space between his ears, dulling the edge of his thoughts, but never quite silencing them. He made his way back toward the river quarter, where the city's lifeblood ebbed and flowed with the tide. In better seasons, the banks would be lined with boats, their hulls laden with grain, spices, barrels of salted fish. Laughter and shouts would ring from the taverns at the water's edge, and lanterns would swing from the rigging like stars caught low enough to touch. But now the docks were mostly silent, the warehouses shuttered tight, their windows crossed with boards to keep out thieves and sickness. Roderick paused at the crest of a small footbridge that arched over a sluggish canal. The water below was black as pitch, reflecting only the dull sheen of the lantern he carried. He watched it swirl around a drifting scrap of cloth, a torn sleeve perhaps carried from some riverside washing line, or torn from the back of a soul too weak to hold their own cloak. The city gave up its dead to the river sometimes, when the pits grew too full or the grave diggers too fearful. He tried not to think of what lay beneath the water's dark skin. A sound behind him pulled him from his reverie, a faint scuff of boots on wet planks. He turned to see a figure huddled beneath a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders stooped, cloak clutched close against the rain. It was a boy, older than the child he had fed that morning, but still young enough to look at the mask with a mixture of awe and terror. "Lord Doctor," the boy said, voice rough from cold or hunger, or both. He held out a scrap of parchment, folded and sealed with a smudge of wax too thin to bear any mark of house or name. "From the brewer's wife, she said to find you." Roderick took the note with gloved hands, careful not to let his lantern gutter in the wind. He broke the seal with a thumb, squinting at the words inked in a trembling hand. The message was simple, an address, a plea for help, a promise of coin that meant nothing to him now. He folded it again and tucked it inside his sleeve. "You have a mother, boy?" he asked, his voice muffled by the leather beak. The boy nodded. "I'm Lord. Go to her. Keep to the dry if you can." He dug into the pouch at his belt, found the last of the small loaves Anselma had pressed upon him seasons ago, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. He placed it in the boy's hand, closing the thin fingers around it. "Eat, and remember you saw nothing of me tonight." The boy's eyes widened at that, but he only nodded again before darting away, swallowed by the mist that clung to the river's edge. Roderick watched him go, heart aching at the way hunger could twist a child's courage into a weapon sharp enough to cut through any fear, even fear of the plague doctor's mask. He crossed the bridge and found the brewer's house tucked between two larger warehouses, its shutters half rotten, the door sagging on leather hinges. The smell met him before he reached the threshold, a sour, sickly scent that rose from the cracks in the planks and clung to the puddles in the yard. Death waited here too, patient as ever. He knocked. After a pause, the door opened on a narrow chain, revealing a sliver of pale face framed by a woolen scarf. The woman behind it could not have been more than 30, yet her eyes were clouded with exhaustion older than her years. "Doctor," she breathed, and the chain slipped free. Inside, the house was dim and close. A single rushlight flickered in the corner, casting shadows that danced over rough-hewn furniture and barrels stacked near the hearth. The smell of brewing, sweet malt, sour yeast, might have once been comforting, but now it mingled with the unmistakable reek of sickness. She led him to a back room, past a child asleep on a pallet near the coals, a dog curled tight beside him, one eye cracked open to watch the stranger pass. In the bed against the far wall lay the brewer himself, a broad man once thick with muscle, now wasted to hollow shoulders and sunken cheeks. His skin was pale as tallow, except where it bloomed dark beneath his jaw, angry swellings that marked the plague's merciless claim. Roderick drew close, the mask's beak dipping as he leaned over the man's chest. He listened to the rasping breath, counted the fevered pulse that leapt beneath clammy skin. The brewer stirred, cracked open crusted eyes, tried to speak. Only a thin croak emerged, more sigh than word. Roderick set to work with the small comforts he could offer. Herbs for the woman to steep in broth, instructions for washing linens, a promise to speak prayers if that was what she wished. She asked him questions. Would he live? Would the child in the next room be spared? And each question fell upon him like a stone he could not dodge. He answered with the soft gentleness he had learned long ago, the voice that comforted even as it confessed there was no saving to be had. Hours passed there, though they felt like moments caught between heartbeats. Rain beat against the shutter. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. The candle guttered low. And when the brewer's breathing eased into that final, sighing quiet, Roderick felt the familiar chill settle into his bones, a hush so absolute it seemed to swallow the whole of the small house. He stood, weary knees protesting. The woman pressed coins into his hand, a reflex that spoke more of hope than of need. He did not refuse her, though he would leave them on her threshold before he vanished into the rain once more. At the door, he paused. The child by the hearth slept on, the dog's tail thumping once in sleepy recognition. The mother's eyes shone in the half-dark, not with tears. She had none left to shed, but with a hollow resolve that told him she would not succumb, not yet. She would hold this fragile shell of life together, if only for a night longer. He stepped outside into the rain. It welcomed him like an old friend, washing over the beak, the cloak, the gloves that held too much sorrow in their seams. He walked on, deeper into the city that never slept, that never truly woke, that lay fevered and restless beneath the endless rhythm of the falling storm. By the time dawn found the rooftops, the rain had dwindled to a thin drizzle, a soft whisper on the cobbles that glistened like fish scales beneath the new sun. Roderick stood beneath the low archway of an abandoned cooper's shop, sheltering for a moment beneath the sagging eaves. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, from the curve of the beaked mask, from the folds of his cloak that hung heavy with the night's vigil. He watched the street stir to life in fits and starts. A woman crossed the square, shoulders hunched, skirts gathered high from the wet, a basket of stale bread tucked under one arm. An old man leaned on a stick by the fountain, staring at the water that trickled from a cracked lion's mouth into the mossy basin below. A pair of dogs sniffed at each other in the gutter, tails wagging slow and cautious, as if they too knew the world was not safe even at its gentlest. The plague did not strike like a thunderclap, sudden and gone. It seeped instead, like rain through a roof left too long untended. It found the smallest cracks in the lives of the poor and the proud alike, and once inside, it settled deep, patient as a spider waiting in the rafters. Roderick pushed himself away from the wall, boots splashing through a shallow puddle that mirrored a pale, watery sky. He made his way down a side street where the houses leaned together as if whispering secrets he would rather not hear. He had a name, scrawled in charcoal on a scrap of parchment that was now damp and almost illegible. Another door. Another family waiting for a cure he did not carry. The house sat behind a low garden fence choked with weeds. Once, perhaps, roses had grown there. He saw the brittle stalks, thorny and bare, clinging to a trellis warped with age. A child's toy, a small wooden horse on wheels, lay half submerged in mud by the gate. He lifted the latch and stepped into the yard, boots sinking in the sodden earth. He did not need to knock. The door swung open before his gloved hand touched it. A man stood there, younger than Roderick by half a decade perhaps, but already worn thin. His eyes darted to the mask, then away, settling somewhere near the doctor's shoulder, as if unable to bear the sight of what he had summoned. "Inside," the man said, voice ragged with sleeplessness. He stepped back, fingers twitching at the hem of his shirt. The cottage smelled of boiled roots and damp linen. The hearth was cold, the embers long dead. In the center of the small room lay a pallet, and upon it, a girl curled like a fawn in tall grass. She could not have seen more than 10 summers. Her hair was pale, her face flushed with fever, lips cracked around a shallow breath that rattled in her chest. Roderick knelt by her side. The mask's beak brushed the edge of the blanket as he leaned close, listening, counting, feeling for the telltale swellings at her neck and beneath her arms. The father hovered by the wall, arms wrapped tight across his chest, rocking gently as if to keep himself from splintering apart. "When did it start?" Roderick asked, voice muffled and soft. The man swallowed. "2 nights ago, she complained of chills. Then the lumps came. I tried the vinegar. I burned rosemary." His voice broke like old timber. "Nothing helps." Roderick nodded once, more to himself than the father. He drew out his small knife, the edges stained with herbs, not blood. He worked in silence, slicing cloth into strips, mixing crushed sage with rose oil, layering it over a clean rag. He showed the father how to press it against the swellings, how to cool her forehead with linen dipped in water that smelled faintly of mint. He did not promise a cure. He offered only tasks, small labors that gave the hand something to do when the heart was helpless. As he worked, he felt the child's breath catch beneath his fingertips. Her lashes fluttered once, and for a moment her eyes opened, wide and glazed with fever's sheen. She stared at the mask, unafraid, and her lips moved around a word too faint for him to catch. A question, or perhaps a plea? He wanted, more than anything, to lift the mask and show her a face that was only human. No beak, no barrier, only a man who wished to keep the darkness at bay. But he did not. He could not. The mask was part of him now, as necessary as the gloves on his hands, the herbs in his satchel. When he finished, he rose slowly, knees aching from the cold stone floor. He laid a hand on the father's shoulder, the touch gentle but firm. "Stay with her," he said. "Speak softly. Let her hear you." The father nodded, mouth pressed tight to keep the grief from spilling out. Roderick stepped back into the small yard, the door closing behind him with a hush like a final breath. The drizzle had given way to a low, creeping fog that curled around the houses, wrapping the street in a muffled quiet. Somewhere distant, a bell tolled twice, 2 more gone to the pit, or perhaps 2 more beds waiting for his knock. He paused by the fence, gloved fingers brushing the wooden horse half buried in mud. For a moment he knelt and lifted it free, wiping away the clinging dirt. He set it upright beside the gate where the girl might see it if she rose from her fever dream. If she rose. He straightened, drawing his cloak tighter about him. The city stretched ahead, shrouded and waiting, its doors unopened, its secrets unspoken. He stepped back onto the road, boots whispering against wet stones, the mask's hollow eyes fixed forward, the beak pointed toward the next house, the next name, the next quiet vigil that might keep sleep at bay for another night. Morning drifted slowly toward midday as Roderick made his way deeper into the heart of the city, where the streets narrowed, and the walls of the houses leaned so close together that even the pale sun seemed reluctant to slip between them. Here, life clung on in pockets. Families who could not flee the pestilence, who lacked the means or the favor to buy passage to cleaner air in the countryside. They stayed, huddled behind shutters painted with prayers, counting their coughs, bargaining with saints who no longer seemed to answer. He moved through it all like a shadow in daylight, his mask drawing whispered oaths and the crossing of hearts, children peeking from behind skirts and bolted doors to stare at the black bird drifting past their threshold. Once, a boy bold enough to stand his ground called after him, voice cracked but curious. "Master Doctor, do you have a bird under that mask?" Roderick paused, the leather beak turning slowly to regard the child. He saw the mother rush forward, seize her son by the arm, drag him back behind the door with a hissed rebuke. But for a heartbeat, Roderick felt a smile ghost behind the mask, a flicker of something like warmth in a heart that had grown too accustomed to cold. He turned away, leaving the question unanswered, and pressed on. By the time he reached the small square near the fishmonger's lane, his boots were crusted with mud, and the damp of the night clung to the folds of his cloak. The square once bustled with stalls and carts, barrels brimming with salted herring and eels, fresh from the river's nets. Now, only a few tarpaulin sheets flapped in the faint breeze, abandoned by vendors too afraid to hawk their wares where the sickness stalked so freely. At the far end of the square stood a house that leaned so far forward it seemed ready to bow into the street. Its windows were shuttered tight, but he could see the faint glimmer of candlelight through the cracks. A scrap of linen fluttered from the lintel, stained with something dark and stiff. It was the sign, a silent plea for the plague doctor to stop here next. Roderick raised a gloved hand and knocked twice, slow and deliberate. The door creaked inward, just enough for a thin face to appear. A girl of perhaps 12, her hair cropped short, eyes too large for a face already pinched with hunger. She did not flinch at the mask. Perhaps she had seen it before. Perhaps she had already learned that fear was a luxury for those who could still run. "Mama's sick," she said without prompting. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. "She asked for you." He nodded and she stepped back, allowing him into the dim hush of the single room that held their entire life. A hearth smoldered in the corner, but the warmth never seemed to reach the damp that clung to the cracked plaster walls. On a straw pallet near the hearth lay the mother, young still, though illness had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones and left her skin waxen. She looked up when he entered, eyes glinting with fever's restless fire. Roderick knelt beside her. She tried to speak, but her breath caught in her chest, a dry rasp that spoke louder than words. He loosened the blanket at her throat, felt the heat rolling off her in waves. Beneath her jaw, the buboes were hard and tight as knots of rope. He could feel the trembling of her limbs even through the thin coverlet. He unpacked his satchel, his movements careful, deliberate. He mixed herbs, thyme, lavender, mint, crushed fine in a small clay mortar. He dribbled vinegar over the mixture, stirring it with a wooden spoon worn smooth by countless hours of this same ritual. The girl watched him from a corner, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes tracking every motion as if she might memorize the art and save her mother herself. When the poultice was ready, he lifted the cloth to her throat, pressing it gently against the swellings. The mother gasped at the chill, eyes closing, a single tear slipping into the matted strands of her hair. Roderick murmured to her, low words no one else needed to hear, scraps of comfort that held no power except in the saying. Beside him, the girl edged closer until she crouched at her mother's head, fingers brushing the fevered brow. "Will she die?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut. He did not look at her. He focused on tying the cloth in place, adjusting the blanket. When he spoke, the mask made his words sound like they drifted from a cave. "You must keep her warm. Give her broth if she will take it. Rest beside her if you can. Your voice will help her stay." The girl nodded, pressing her lips together. She would not cry. He saw it in her, this small flint of a soul that refused to break. When it was done, he set aside the mortar, wiped the residue from his gloves. He reached into his satchel once more and drew out a small twist of cloth, tied with twine, a few dried rose petals mixed with sage. He pressed it into the girl's hand. "For her pillow," he said. "The scent may ease her breath." She held it like a relic, clutching it tight as she knelt beside her mother once more. Roderick rose, the leather of his mask creaking faintly as he straightened. He looked once more at the mother, her breathing shallow but steady for now, the fever burning but not yet victorious. Then he turned and stepped toward the door. Outside, the square lay empty, but for the soft rustle of the wind tugging at the abandoned tarpaulins. He pulled his cloak closer around him, felt the damp cling to the mask, the chill seep beneath his skin. Behind him, he heard the girl's voice, soft, low, a lullaby for a mother drifting somewhere between this world and the next. He let it follow him as he crossed the square, boots tapping a slow rhythm on the cobbles. One more door behind him, countless more ahead, and always the same hollow promise echoing in the hush between footfalls. Tomorrow he would return, if tomorrow would still have him. The sun had climbed higher now, a weak disk veiled by drifting clouds that lent the city a false softness, as if daylight alone might scrub away the sickness hidden behind its shuttered windows. Roderick moved through it like a drifting wraith, his shadow sliding across doorposts marked with black crosses, past piles of old straw swept into the gutters, past corners where cats prowled, lean and restless, their yellow eyes watching every step. His path led him now toward the old monastery district, an ancient quarter of stone and hush, where squat buildings hunched together behind walls that once promised sanctuary, but now held only echoes. It had been years since monks moved freely through these streets in their brown habits, chanting prayers at dawn and dusk. Most were gone now, the pestilence having found them despite their faith and their distant cloisters. Yet the monastery infirmary still clung on, barely alive, manned by a handful of friars too stubborn or too faithful to abandon the dying. When the city's doctors turned their eyes elsewhere or fell ill themselves, the monastery's doors stayed open. Roderick had passed through them many times, sometimes for knowledge, sometimes to lend what thin skill he possessed to those who called him brother, despite the beaked mask that marked him as something other, something half-feared. He approached the outer gate, where ivy climbed the crumbling stones and a small iron bell hung by a length of frayed rope. He tugged it once, twice. The sound rang thin and tired, swallowed almost at once by the thick air. After a moment, the gate shifted. A young friar peered out. Brother Tom, his hair hidden beneath a stained hood, his face hollow but eyes sharp with the fever of duty. He opened the gate wide enough for Roderick to slip through. "Brother Roderick," Tom murmured, his voice hoarse from long hours whispering prayers over the dying. "We wondered if you'd come today." Roderick only nodded. Words cost too much here, where every breath might carry the seeds of death. Together they crossed the courtyard, a patch of earth where the last herbs struggled to survive. Rosemary grew thin along the wall, pale lavender pressed close to the stones for warmth. The smell of them brushed Roderick's senses even through the mask's herbs and vinegar. It almost made him wish he could lift it, if only for a moment. Inside the infirmary, the air pressed down like a damp cloth. Straw covered the stone floors in uneven heaps, changed when they could find time and hands to do so. Low beds lined the walls, some occupied by men and women who groaned and turned in fever dreams, others by figures, so still they might have been sleeping if not for the flies that gathered at the corners of cloth. Brother Tom led him to the far end, where a partition of old linen offered the smallest semblance of privacy. There, Sister Alice sat on a low stool, her back bent as she pressed a damp rag to the brow of an old merchant whose breaths rattled like dry leaves. She looked up when Roderick entered, her eyes lined with exhaustion, yet clear enough to greet him with the smallest nod. "He asked for you," she said softly. "He believes you can take his confession." Roderick set down his satchel beside her. The irony bit at him. He was no priest, no confessor, only a man who wore a mask and carried herbs. But for the dying, the shape of mercy mattered more than its truth. He knelt beside the pallet, leaning close. The old merchant's eyes flickered open, cloudy and bright all at once, like a candle about to gutter out. "Forgive me, Father," the man rasped, lips cracked, voice ragged as the straw beneath him. Roderick laid a gloved hand upon the man's wrist, frail bones beneath loose skin, the pulse faint but fluttering still. "Speak what weighs upon you," he murmured, the mask turning his words into something distant yet kind. The old man spoke in fits and starts, of coins hoarded, of bread denied to the hungry, of envy that soured what might have been a decent life. His voice faded between sentences, breath catching on memories that no longer mattered to the world beyond these thin walls. And Roderick listened, though he could offer no absolution. He let the dying man's words pass through him like a prayer for his own restless soul. When the last confession fell silent, the merchant's chest stilled beneath his palm. Sister Alice reached forward, closing the man's eyes with gentle fingers that trembled only when she thought no one watched. They worked together then, cleansing the man's brow with rose water, straightening the blanket that would cover him until the cart came to carry him away. Brother Tom reappeared with fresh straw and a small cloth of lavender tucked inside the man's folded hands, a final courtesy, a promise that he would not meet the earth with nothing but the smell of decay. Afterward, they stood near the narrow window that let in a sliver of gray light. Alice poured water into a wooden bowl and offered it to Roderick. He dipped his gloved fingers, cleansing the phantom stain from skin that the mask would not let him touch. "You should sleep," she told him, her voice so soft it felt like the memory of sleep itself. "There is more to do," he answered, his words echoing faintly in the hollow beak. She did not argue. She only touched the edge of his sleeve, a small, fleeting gesture of warmth that found its way through the layers of wool and leather and fear. When he stepped back into the courtyard, the garden herbs brushed his cloak once more, their scent clinging to him like a benediction. Beyond the monastery walls, the city waited, its streets quiet for now, but restless beneath the hush. Roderick paused by the gate, glancing once at the bell that swung in the slight breeze. It would toll for him too someday, but not yet. He adjusted the mask, lifted the latch, and stepped out into the world again. One more name on his tongue, one more door to knock upon before the dusk closed in. Outside the monastery walls, the city had begun its slow drift toward evening. The sky hung low and swollen. The clouds tinged a dull pewter that threatened another restless rain. The streets hummed with quiet movement. Traders closing shutters on empty stalls, mothers calling children inside before dusk could snatch them away, the echo of hooves as a lone rider clattered past, cloak whipping behind him like a dark banner fleeing the city's creeping sickness. Roderick stood for a moment beneath the monastery's archway, the iron gate shut behind him with a soft finality. He adjusted the beaked mask upon his face, feeling the faint shift of air within its confines. The herbs he packed inside, rosemary, mint, a sliver of orange peel, were stale now, the scent a memory more than a shield. Still, it was habit. And habit was sometimes all that kept the plague from devouring him whole. He turned east, moving along the wall, where the city's poorest quarter pressed tight against its old stones. Here, the lanes were narrower still, barely wide enough for a man to pass without brushing shoulder to timber wall. Washing lines sagged overhead, heavy with damp cloth that dripped into the muck below. Voices drifted from open windows. Soft arguments, lullabies, prayers murmured to saints whose icons were worn smooth by countless trembling fingers. A woman waited at the mouth of a crooked alley. She saw him coming and shrank back a step, clutching a bundle wrapped in a threadbare shawl to her chest, her eyes, large and dark beneath a frayed kerchief, locked on the mask. She did not speak until he paused before her, his shadow falling over the muddy flagstones at her feet. "Master Doctor," she whispered, her words near drowned in the hush of the alley. "Please, my husband. He's inside. He cannot rise." Roderick only nodded. She stepped aside, pressing her back to the damp wall as he passed. He ducked beneath the low lintel of her door, the room beyond so small he could nearly touch both walls with outstretched arms. Smoke clung to the rafters, the remnants of a fire that had burned too low for warmth. The husband lay on a straw pallet, half covered by a blanket patched with scraps of old tunics. His chest rose and fell with a slow, labored rhythm, each breath rattling as if pulled through water. Roderick knelt beside him, feeling the chill that radiated off skin flushed hot beneath the surface. He pressed his gloved fingers gently along the man's neck, tracing the swollen lumps that lay hidden there like coiled serpents. The woman hovered at the door, wringing the cloth in her hands until the fabric threatened to tear. "He was strong, sir," she said, her voice shaking. "A mason. His hands, like stone. But 3 days now, and he has not spoken." Roderick did not answer at once. He pulled aside the blanket, checking the man's chest for signs of rupture, for the bruising that sometimes marked the final hours. There was none yet, only the steady drum of fever and the soft, wheezing gasp of lungs drowning in their own humors. He opened his satchel, withdrawing what meager comforts he could offer. A small vial of vinegar infused with lavender, a twist of cloth soaked in mint water. He showed the woman how to dab it at her husband's temples, how to lift his head and coax a sip between cracked lips if he could swallow. Each instruction spoken slowly, gently, as if the very softness of his words might ease the sharpness of what could not be mended. As she bent to follow his gestures, Roderick studied her face, the hollow of her cheeks, the desperate resolve that flickered like a candle behind her exhaustion. He wondered if she had eaten today, or the day before. If she had children hidden in some back room, watching through cracks in the boards as the black-beaked figure bent over their father. When he rose to leave, the woman caught his cloak in trembling fingers. "You will come again, sir?" she asked, though it was not truly a question. It was a prayer, left raw and fragile between them. "I will come," he said, though the words felt brittle inside the mask. He could not promise life, but he could promise to return, to bear witness, to stand between the living and the dying for a little while longer. He stepped back into the alley, the hush of the cramped room folding closed behind him. The woman did not follow him out. She knelt instead by the pallet, her voice low as she spoke to the man who could no longer hear her, or perhaps heard her from some distant shore where fever carried him beyond reach. Outside, the sky had begun to bruise with the purple of oncoming dusk. The city shifted around him, a restless thing made of sighs and footsteps, of doors closing and windows shuttering against the long dark. Roderick pulled his cloak tighter about him, feeling the weight of the mask grow heavier with every passing hour. He did not head for home. Instead, he turned toward the old road that led to the city's eastern fringe, where the pest pits lay, a stretch of churned earth where the gravediggers worked by lantern light, muttering oaths and prayers in equal measure as they lowered bodies into the soil. He did not go there to linger. He could not bear that yet. But he paused at the crest of the rise, where he could see the flicker of torches moving like fireflies between the mounds. A faint chant drifted up, broken by the shovel's steady scrape. He stood a long while, breathing the sharp air through the mask's stale herbs, and in that breathless hush between wind and whisper, he let himself imagine, for just a heartbeat, that somewhere beyond this city's walls lay a place untouched by the plague's creeping fingers, a place where he might someday lay down the mask and find his face still waiting beneath it. When the cold had sunk deep enough into his bones to wake him from that small dream, he turned back toward the city. His boots struck the road in slow, steady rhythm. One more night waited, and behind it, countless more, each marked by the same soft promise that he would stand where others turned away, his beaked shadow drifting from door to door until the plague forgot his name. The road from the pest pits curved back toward the city's old eastern gate, where the wall sagged with age and rain, its stones slick with moss, and the slow creep of ivy reclaiming mortar that no mason had tended in decades. Roderick paused beneath an ancient archway where the stonework bore the faint, weathered carving of saints whose eyes had long since eroded into blank, pitiless sockets. He rested a hand against the cold wall, feeling the pulse of his own heart through the glove, a reminder that he still lived, if only for tonight. Beyond the gate, the city lay hushed in the deepening dusk. Lanterns flickered here and there, oil burning low in iron cages that swung gently in the breeze. A dog barked once in the distance, sharp, defiant, before falling silent. The wind carried the smell of the river mixed with the faint tang of smoke and wet wood. Somewhere a bell tolled 6 slow strokes. Roderick listened to each one, as though it might count down the moments left to him. He turned from the wall and walked on. His path wound into the older quarter, where the houses leaned so close they seemed to press secrets into each other's beams. Here the streets were narrower still, cobbles worn smooth by centuries of boots and cartwheels and barefoot children who now hid behind locked shutters. The air felt thicker here, closer, laden with the smell of damp earth and the faint, sweet rot of leaves that gathered in gutters and corners where no broom had passed for weeks. He stopped before a small house wedged between 2 taller buildings whose roofs nearly touched above the alley, forming a tunnel that smelled of mildew and stale cooking. This door bore no black cross, but he knew the sign painted on the lintel, a simple mark, 2 strokes of chalk, a secret signal passed mouth to mouth among those too poor for coin but rich in desperate hope. He knocked softly, 3 times. A moment later, the door cracked open. A young man peered out, hair unkempt, eyes wide and rimmed red. He looked at the mask first, flinched as all did, then forced himself to meet the hollow gaze beneath the beak. "Master Doctor," the young man whispered. His voice was raw, as if scraped by days without sleep. "She's worse. Please come." Roderick stepped inside. The air was close and stale, thick with the lingering smoke of tallow candles and the sourness of unwashed cloth. The young man led him through a single cramped room where 3 children huddled near the hearth, watching with eyes too old for their small faces. They did not speak, only clutched each other tighter as the mask passed by. Beyond a thin curtain she lay, an old woman, bones sharp beneath a blanket patched so many times it seemed more stitched than fabric. Her hair was thin, spilling across a pillow that smelled of lavender faded to memory. Her lips moved faintly when Roderick knelt beside her, the mask's beak brushing the stale air above her face. "She keeps calling for my father," the young man murmured, kneeling opposite him. "But he's gone. Dead these 10 years. Roderick nodded. He took her hand in his gloved fingers, felt the heat of fever still burning in flesh that was otherwise paper-thin and cold. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded unseeing, yet for a moment they fixed on the black hollow of the mask. A small smile, impossibly tender, flickered at the corners of her cracked lips. He knew that smile. He had seen it 100 times before, a glimpse of some distant warmth remembered just before the dark. He leaned closer, voice low and muffled behind the mask's stale herbs. "Rest easy," he murmured. "The house is warm. Your children are here." Whether she heard him or not, the smile lingered as her breathing grew shallow, then shallower still, until it was nothing at all but the soft hush of the blanket settling where her chest no longer rose. The young man bowed his head. No tears came, only the stillness of a grief so old and so constant that it no longer needed the relief of weeping. Roderick sat with him a moment longer, his hand still holding the dead woman's frail fingers, as if the warmth might return if only he waited long enough. When at last he stood, the young man rose too. He pressed a small pouch of coin into Roderick's palm, but the plague doctor set it gently on the blanket instead. "Keep it," he said, the words dry and distant within the mask. "For bread, for warmth." The young man tried to speak, but found no voice. He only nodded once, then turned to kneel beside his mother's still form, whispering words in a tongue older than the city itself. A lullaby or a prayer. Roderick could not tell which. He stepped back into the single room where the children waited. They shrank from him at first, then stared when he bent to place a small twist of dried herbs by the hearth, a gift of rosemary and sage Anselma had given him long ago, meant to keep the worst scents at bay. He knew it would not drive out the plague stain, but perhaps it would sweeten the air enough for one more night's sleep. Outside, the alley seemed narrower still as he stepped into it. The sky overhead had deepened into bruised indigo, the first pinpricks of starlight lost behind a veil of low cloud. Somewhere a shutter creaked open, then shut again before he could glimpse the face behind it. Roderick drew his cloak closer, the mask's beak dipping as he moved back into the night. The old woman's smile lingered behind his eyes as he walked, soft, fleeting, gone now, except for the memory pressed like a bruise upon his ribs. Ahead, the city breathed in the dark, each house another door he would knock upon before sleep. Each door, another story, another name. Each name a whisper waiting to slip through his gloved hands like sand in an hourglass he could never quite turn back. There were evenings when the wind coiled itself around the crooked streets of the town, carrying with it the secrets whispered behind shuttered windows and bolted doors. In those hours when the world seemed suspended between silence and the echo of unspoken fears, Master Lucien found himself drifting through his memories like a solitary shadow, drawn ever backward to the moment he first understood that the mask he wore was not merely of leather and glass, but of something far more suffocating. That winter, the frost settled in the bones of the living and the dead alike. The graves lay shallow, hastily covered by thin blankets of earth that the wind sometimes swept aside, revealing the pale hollows of forgotten faces. Each morning, Lucien would rouse himself from his narrow cot, pull on his stiff garments, and lift the beaked mask that had grown so familiar that he wondered if his own features still existed beneath it. The ties at the back of his neck tugged his hair as he secured them, the smell of dried herbs and vinegar ever present, a small ward against a tide that cared not for wards. He moved through the town with the slow dignity of one who had accepted both his duty and his doom. The children, if they glimpsed him from attic windows, fled into corners, clinging to mothers who themselves trembled like candles guttering in the wind. At first, Lucien had tried to speak to them, to soothe them with gentle gestures, to remind them that within the black cloak and the bird's mask was a man who once laughed and told stories by the hearth. But the mask was louder than his voice. It declared him something other, something spectral, an omen with a cane and a ledger who came not to heal, but to measure how many breaths remained. On this night, his steps led him to the edge of the town, where the old convent stood half abandoned, its stones grayed with age and secrets. Sister Adeline, one of the last who dared remain within those walls, had sent word by a trembling novice. The fever had claimed 3 more within the day, and the air in the cloisters grew thick with the scent of sweat and despair. Lucien paused at the threshold of the convent gate, resting his gloved hand on the iron latch. Beyond it, the garden lay in ragged ruin, herbs trampled underfoot by desperate feet, the well brimming with brackish water, candles guttering in niches by the door where prayers drifted like smoke to a god who seemed to have turned his face elsewhere. Inside, Sister Adeline waited for him in the small chamber that once served as the infirmary, but now felt more like an antechamber to the grave. Her veil had slipped back, revealing hair streaked with gray, eyes sunken yet sharp with a kind of fierce compassion. She greeted him not with fear, but with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo in the hollows of the stone walls. "Master Lucien," she whispered, dipping her head, "there are 2 sisters in the East Wing who yet breathe. They ask for comfort, though I fear they do not truly believe any remains." Lucien nodded, the beak of his mask dipping with him. He wanted to speak words of hope, to remind her that his presence meant care, meant an effort to stand against the tide. But the words turned to ashes in his throat. He had learned, in the passing seasons, that there were moments when silence was the only mercy he could offer. He followed her through corridors where candles burned low, where the air tasted of stale prayers and sickly herbs. The first sister lay on a narrow cot, her hands folded over her chest, lips moving in a silent litany. Lucien kneeled beside her, listening to the rattle in her lungs. He lifted a vial from the folds of his cloak, measured out a few drops onto her tongue, though he knew it was more for ritual than remedy. Her eyes fluttered open, finding the mask first, and for a heartbeat he thought she might cry out. Instead, she managed a weak smile, a gratitude so frail it nearly undid him. Outside her chamber, Sister Adeline lingered in the shadows. She watched Lucien with an expression that spoke of countless nights spent in vigil, of faith stretched thin as spider silk yet still unbroken. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if the mask is the only thing that keeps the sickness away? Or if perhaps it traps it within you?" Lucien's hand paused on the brim of his hat. He thought of the hours spent breathing through layers of cloth soaked in vinegar and camphor, of the weight of the beak pressing down on his nose and cheeks, until he felt part man, part carrion bird. "I wonder many things, sister," he said at last. "I wonder if the sickness sees me at all, or if I am merely its herald." She did not argue. Instead, she turned to the narrow window, where the moon pressed its pale face to the glass. "There are whispers," she said after a while, "that the plague has turned east towards the river towns. Perhaps when spring comes, it will be gone." Lucien did not tell her that spring brought its own cruelties, that warmth coaxed the vermin from their burrows, that the fleas and rats would rise again like soldiers in a war that could not be won. He let her hold her hope, fragile as it was. In these walls, hope was rarer than any tincture he could offer. He made his way back through the convent just before dawn, the first pale threads of light weaving through the cloisters. In the courtyard, a novice sat hunched on a bench, a scrap of linen pressed to her mouth, eyes wide and unblinking as she watched him pass. Lucien paused, the beak of his mask casting a long shadow over the cobblestones. He wanted to tell her to run, to flee to the hills where the air was clean and the rivers clear. But he knew that for some there was no fleeing. They were bound to these stones, to these prayers, to the graves they tended. Outside, the frost had begun to thaw. The earth grew soft beneath his boots as he walked, each step pulling him deeper into a dawn that felt no warmer than the night. Somewhere ahead, the town stirred. A rooster's cry, a door creaking open, the faint echo of footsteps on wood. Life, stubborn and soft, pressed on despite the mask, despite the sickness, despite the certainty that before long he would return to the convent gates again. As he reached the edge of the graveyard, Lucien paused. He removed the mask for a moment, lifting it from his face so he could feel the chill morning air against his skin. It was a small defiance, a reminder that beneath the beak and the cloak, he was still a man who could taste the cold, who could feel it bite his cheeks and sting his eyes. He looked at the rows of mounds, the crude crosses jutting from the earth like broken teeth, and wondered how many more names he would ink into his ledger before the thaw was done. He set the mask back in place, tying it tight. The world blurred behind the glass lenses once more. muffled by the scent of wilted herbs. Lucien turned away from the graves, cane tapping softly against the path as he returned to his rounds. One more shadow in a town that had forgotten how to dream of anything but survival. The corridors of the convent seemed narrower now, their walls pressing in with the weight of whispered prayers and restless souls. Lucien's steps echoed softly along the flagstones, the tap of his cane like a distant heartbeat that reminded him, with every measured strike, that he was still among the living, though at times he wondered if he merely haunted these halls as another restless spirit. Within the infirmary, the air was thick with the low hum of fevered murmurs and the brittle rasp of strained breathing. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting shifting shadows across the faces of the sick who lay upon pallets hastily arranged along the walls. Some turned their heads as Lucien passed, their eyes wide and glassy, pupils chasing the glint of his mask's polished lenses. Others stared upward at the cracked ceiling, their lips moving in silent confession to a god who seemed ever more distant with each passing day. Sister Adeline walked beside him, her steps quiet, her veil brushing against the rough stone of the walls. She carried a bowl of water scented faintly with rosemary and vinegar, a poor guardian against what crept unseen among them. Lucien paused by each patient, listening, watching, feeling for pulses that fluttered like frightened birds beneath thin skin. He spoke little, for there were few words left that could offer comfort when the world itself seemed bent on unraveling. At the far end of the chamber, a young woman lay beneath a patchwork blanket, her hair damp with sweat, strands clinging to her hollow cheeks. She could not have been more than 17, yet the furrow in her brow belonged to someone who had already glimpsed too much of the grave. Her breathing rattled like dry leaves caught in a winter wind. Lucien knelt, the leather of his coat creaking as he shifted. He reached for her wrist, gloved fingers pressing gently against the delicate beat of her pulse. Her eyes fluttered open, dark lashes lifting to reveal irises that glimmered with something more than fever, a question perhaps, or a plea unspoken. "Can you hear me?" Lucien asked, his voice muffled but soft within the hollow of the mask. The girl's lips moved, a soundless shape that might have been his name, or no name at all. He took a damp cloth from Sister Adeline and dabbed it against her brow, feeling the heat rise through the linen like smoke from a dying hearth. "She came from the river village," Adeline whispered behind him. "They say she walked for 2 days before she collapsed at our gates." Lucien's heart sank beneath the layers of his mask and cloak. The river village. He had heard rumors whispered in the marketplace, rumors of boats drifting ashore with no living crew, of entire households gone silent behind locked doors. If the plague had found its way down the water, there would be no end to it. The river was a vein that fed countless towns, carried life and now death with it. He murmured a blessing over the girl's brow, though his words felt stale upon his tongue. He gave her a draught of bitter syrup, knowing it would not heal, but might ease the ache within her bones. When her eyelids fluttered shut once more, Lucien let the cloth fall into the basin with a soft splash. He rose joints stiff and looked to Sister Adeline, who watched him with the same weary dread that he felt gathering in his own chest. "Is there more we can do?" she asked, though her tone betrayed no hope of a different answer. Lucien shook his head, the beak of his mask dipping like the nod of a carrion bird. "Keep them warm. Keep the air moving if you can. Pray for strength, sister, for all of us." Outside the infirmary, the convent halls were restless with quiet steps and hushed weeping. Novices moved like pale ghosts, bearing bowls of broth, carrying soiled linens to be boiled and burned. Lucien paused in an alcove where a single candle flickered before a small wooden cross. He allowed himself the smallest mercy, lifting the mask just enough to let the stale air trapped within drift away. He inhaled the cold, musty breath of the stones, savoring the sharpness of it. In that moment, a memory crept upon him, unbidden, unwanted, of his own father's hand upon his brow when he had been but a boy, fevered and trembling in a cot by the hearth. He remembered the warmth of that hand, the low hum of his father's voice singing an old prayer for healing. His father had not worn a mask. He had not kept his distance. He had pressed his palm to his son's burning skin and held it there until the fever broke, or until it claimed him in turn. Lucien pulled the mask back over his face and tied the straps tight once more. That warmth belonged to another life, a life left behind when he chose this path, when he agreed to stand where others fled. He pushed himself away from the alcove and stepped back into the darkened passageway where Sister Adeline awaited him with another name, another room, another bed, where hope flickered like a dying flame. As night fell once more, the convent's bell tolled low and mournful over the rooftops of the town. From his ledger, Lucien tore a page that had grown too stained with rain and sweat to bear another line. He pressed a fresh sheet against the wooden cover, dipped his quill, and began again. Another name, another day, another mask tied tight. And always beyond the convent walls, the river ran black and silent under the pale gaze of the moon, carrying away prayers that no longer reached any shore. The corridors of the convent seemed narrower now, their walls pressing in with the weight of whispered prayers and restless souls. Lucien's steps echoed softly along the flagstones, the tap of his cane like a distant heartbeat that reminded him, with every measured strike, that he was still among the living. Though at times he wondered if he merely haunted these halls as another restless spirit. Within the infirmary, the air was thick with the low hum of fevered murmurs and the brittle rasp of strained breathing. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting shifting shadows across the faces of the sick who lay upon pallets hastily arranged along the walls. Some turned their heads as Lucien passed, their eyes wide and glassy, pupils chasing the glint of his mask's polished lenses. Others stared upward at the cracked ceiling, their lips moving in silent confession to a God who seemed ever more distant with each passing day. Sister Adeline walked beside him, her steps quiet, her veil brushing against the rough stone of the walls. She carried a bowl of water, scented faintly with rosemary and vinegar, a poor guardian against what crept unseen among them. Lucien paused by each patient, listening, watching, feeling for pulses that fluttered like frightened birds beneath thin skin. He spoke little, for there were few words left that could offer comfort when the world itself seemed bent on unraveling. At the far end of the chamber, a young woman lay beneath a patchwork blanket, her hair damp with sweat, strands clinging to her hollow cheeks. She could not have been more than 17, yet the furrow in her brow belonged to someone who had already glimpsed too much of the grave. Her breathing rattled like dry leaves caught in a winter wind. Lucien knelt, the leather of his coat creaking as he shifted. He reached for her wrist, gloved fingers pressing gently against the delicate beat of her pulse. Her eyes fluttered open, dark lashes lifting to reveal irises that glimmered with something more than fever. A question, perhaps, or a plea unspoken. "Can you hear me?" Lucien asked, his voice muffled but soft within the hollow of the mask. The girl's lips moved, a soundless shape that might have been his name, or no name at all. He took a damp cloth from Sister Adeline and dabbed it against her brow, feeling the heat rise through the linen like smoke from a dying hearth. "She came from the river village," Adeline whispered behind him. "They say she walked for 2 days before she collapsed at our gates." Lucien's heart sank beneath the layers of his mask and cloak. The river village. He had heard rumors whispered in the marketplace, rumors of boats drifting ashore with no living crew, of entire households gone silent behind locked doors. If the plague had found its way down the water, there would be no end to it. The river was a vein that fed countless towns, carried life, and now death with it. He murmured a blessing over the girl's brow, though his words felt stale upon his tongue. He gave her a draught of bitter syrup, knowing it would not heal but might ease the ache within her bones. When her eyelids fluttered shut once more, Lucien let the cloth fall into the basin with a soft splash. He rose, joints stiff, and looked to Sister Adeline, who watched him with the same weary dread that he felt gathering in his own chest. "Is there more we can do?" she asked, though her tone betrayed no hope of a different answer. Lucien shook his head, the beak of his mask dipping like the nod of a carrion bird. "Keep them warm. Keep the air moving if you can. Pray for strength, sister. For all of us." Outside the infirmary, the convent halls were restless with quiet steps and hushed weeping. Novices moved like pale ghosts, bearing bowls of broth, carrying soiled linens to be boiled and burned. Lucien paused in an alcove where a single candle flickered before a small wooden cross. He allowed himself the smallest mercy, lifting the mask just enough to let the stale air trapped within drift away. He inhaled the cold, musty breath of the stones, savoring the sharpness of it. In that moment, a memory crept upon him, unbidden, unwanted, of his own father's hand upon his brow when he had been but a boy, fevered and trembling in a cot by the hearth. He remembered the warmth of that hand, the low hum of his father's voice singing an old prayer for healing. His father had not worn a mask. He had not kept his distance. He had pressed his palm to his son's burning skin and held it there until the fever broke, or until it claimed him in turn. Lucien pulled the mask back over his face and tied the straps tight once more. That warmth belonged to another life, a life left behind when he chose this path, when he agreed to stand where others fled. He pushed himself away from the alcove and stepped back into the darkened passageway, where Sister Adeline awaited him with another name, another room, another bed, where hope flickered like a dying flame. As night fell once more, the convent's bell tolled low and mournful over the rooftops of the town. From his ledger, Lucien tore a page that had grown too stained with rain and sweat to bear another line. He pressed a fresh sheet against the wooden cover, dipped his quill, and began again. Another name, another day, another mask tied tight. And always, beyond the convent walls, the river ran black and silent under the pale gaze of the moon, carrying away prayers that no longer reached any shore. As dawn unfurled its pale fingers across the sky, the town lay wrapped in a hush, so complete it felt as though the earth itself held its breath. The frost had retreated, replaced now by a soft mist that clung to the ground and coiled about the ankles of those few souls who dared venture beyond their doors. From within his narrow chamber, Lucien watched the fog drift past the small cracked window, the glass etched with the memory of countless winters. He had slept little, as was his custom now. Sleep felt treacherous, an invitation to dreams that offered warmth and memories best left untouched. Instead, he had sat hunched over his ledger through the deepest hours of the night, the scratch of his quill a lone sound weaving through the convent's silent corridors. Names filled the pages like footprints in fresh snow, each line an echo of a life he could not save. As the first cock crowed somewhere beyond the mist, Lucien rose and gathered his tools with the care of a priest preparing a sacrament. He packed his vials and poultices, wrapped his spare linens, checked the stitching on the seams of his gloves. The mask, resting upon the table like some slumbering bird, waited patiently. He lifted it, studied its beak with a weary familiarity, and tied it on with practiced fingers. When the final knot was secure, he was no longer simply Lucien. He was the doctor again, harbinger and hope in equal measure. Outside the convent gates, the air tasted of damp wood and distant hearth smoke. He could hear the low rumble of carts rattling over muddy ruts, the muttered greetings of townsfolk spoken through doorways barely opened wide enough to admit a hand. No one wished to linger in the street when the doctor passed. Some bowed their heads in gratitude. Others crossed themselves, or whispered prayers that their eyes might never meet his glass lenses up close. Word had come before dawn. A cluster of cottages along the town's eastern edge had grown strangely quiet. No smoke rose from chimneys, where once families had gathered to share thin stews and stale bread. Rumors trickled in like water through a cracked wall, of whole households fallen silent overnight, of cries heard once and then no more. And so, with his cane tapping softly at the earth, Lucien made his way there. He found the cottages huddled together like siblings bracing against a storm. The doors were shut, windows curtained tight. He rapped his cane against the first door. No answer. He tried the latch, unlocked. The hinges creaked a soft lament as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the sour tang of stale sickness. A single candle flickered on a rough-hewn table, its flame a lonely sentinel in the dim. A family of 4 lay upon straw pallets pushed close together near the hearth, though the hearth itself was cold, its ashes scattered like gray snow. A mother's arm draped over her youngest child, her hand frozen in a gesture of comfort that had outlasted breath. Lucien's heart clenched beneath his layers. He knelt, checked for warmth where none remained, then straightened with the slow reverence of one who had grown accustomed to speaking farewell to the unhearing. He made his way from cottage to cottage. In one, a man sat upright in a chair by the window, eyes glassy, a letter clutched in his stiff hand, as though he had written his final thoughts and waited for someone, anyone, to read them. Lucien did not pry the letter free. Some words belonged to the dead alone. At the last door, he paused. A faint sound reached him through the wood, an irregular cough, small but stubborn, as a winter sparrow's song. He pushed the door open and found a girl huddled in a nest of blankets near the hearth. Her face was pale, eyes huge in the shadows. A thin wisp of hair clung to her forehead, damp with fever. She looked at him without fear, her gaze steady on the dark hollows of his mask. Lucien knelt before her, pulling a vial from his satchel with careful hands. He tilted it to her lips, coaxing her to drink, though he knew it would do little more than ease the ache for a few fleeting hours. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice softened by the beak's echo. She nodded, a slight dip of her head that seemed to weigh more than she could bear. He stayed with her until her eyes drifted shut, her breathing rasping in the silence. He left bread within her reach, fresh water beside her palate, though in his heart he feared it was not enough. He closed the door gently behind him, sealing her small island of warmth against the cold mist outside. By midday, Lucien returned to the convent. Sister Adeline waited by the gate, her face drawn but resolute. She asked no questions. His silence spoke all she needed to know. Together they walked through the cloisters, their footsteps weaving through shafts of pale light that fell through the arches like blessings too thin to grasp. In his chamber, Lucien set aside his satchel, stripped away his gloves, and at last removed the mask. He stared at it lying upon the table, its beak curved in mute judgment. He wondered, not for the first time, if it had been worth it. This burden of walking among the sick, of binding his soul within leather and herbs and glass. He wondered if the ledger would ever grow light again, if spring's warmth would wash this darkness from the town's bones. Yet even as he wondered, he knew the truth that sat heavy and quiet within his chest. He would rise again tomorrow, as he always did. He would tie the mask tight, lift his cane, and walk once more into the mist, the fear, the silent houses where life flickered and failed. He would do so until the pages ran out, until the river carried the last rumor of plague away to the sea, until the townsfolk no longer whispered his name like a prayer or a curse. In the hush of his chamber, Lucien closed his eyes and let the weight of his weariness settle over him like a final blessing. For tonight, the mask could rest. But dawn would come, and with it, the doctor would rise once more. One man, one mask, and the endless ledger of names that waited, patient as the grave.